The sun hammered down on Ash Creek like a blacksmith striking a heated iron, relentless and rhythmic in its cruelty. It was late August in the year 1887, and the Colorado high country was gasping for breath. For 3 months, the clouds had offered nothing but empty promises, drifting white and high over the peaks without dropping a single bead of moisture onto the parched valley floor. The grasslands, usually a lush sea of green shifting in the wind, had turned the color of old parchment, brittle enough to crumble between a thumb and forefinger. Dust was the only thing that moved freely. It blew down from the high passes, coating the clapboard storefronts and the hitching rails in a fine, gritty powder that tasted of copper and dead earth. The creek that gave the town its name had retreated to a sluggish trickle, leaving wide margins of cracked mud that baked hard in the heat. Clara Hayes wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of a raw, red hand. She stood behind the small, drafty shack that sat uneasily on the very edge of town, where the respectable streets dissolved into scrub brush and discard. A galvanized tub full of soapy water sat on a stump before her, the surface covered in a gray scum of lye and grime. She plunged her hands back into the water, scrubbing a miner's heavy canvas trousers against the washboard. The knuckle of her right index finger was split, the salt in the soap stinging it with every motion. But Clara did not stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking usually led to counting the coins in the tin jar beneath her floorboards, a sum that never seemed to grow large enough to silence the fear in her chest. A cry rose from the wooden crate she had fashioned into a cradle in the shade of the shack's eaves. "Jamie." Clara dried her hands on her apron and went to him. Her son was 6 months old, a small, pale thing with eyes that seemed too big for his face. He was fussing, his skin hot and damp. "Hush now, little bird," she whispered, lifting him against her shoulder. "It is just the heat. It is just the heat." She swayed gently, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust. From where she stood, she could see the main street of Ash Creek. A wagon was rolling past the general store. The driver hunched over, his hat pulled low against the glare. 2 women in fine calico dresses walked on the boardwalk, holding parasols. As they passed the alley that led toward Clara's shack, they paused. Clara saw their heads turn, saw the brief, sharp gesture of a hand covering a mouth, and then they hurried on, their skirts swishing with exaggerated propriety. Clara stiffened. She knew what they said. They spoke of Thomas, her husband, who had been dead 4 months now. They spoke of the debts he had left at the saloon and the gambling tables. They whispered that a woman who had lived with a man so violent, a man who drank his wages and came home looking for a fight, must have some darkness in her own soul to have endured it. They blamed her for his sins because it was easier than pitying her for her bruises. She held Jamie tighter. They could whisper all they wanted, as long as they paid for the washing. That morning, Mr. Henderson, the landlord who owned the patch of dirt her shack stood on, had come by. He was a soft man with hard eyes. He had told her that the rent was increasing come the 1st of September. He blamed the drought, the cost of water, the price of feed. But Clara knew he simply smelled blood in the water. He knew she had nowhere else to go. She needed $2. It might as well have been 2,000. After settling Jamie back into a fitful sleep, Clara made a decision. The laundry would not be enough this week. She would have to go to the hills. The low-growing sage and common herbs near the town had been picked clean by others or withered by the sun. But high up, in the deep shade of the pine forests, the earth held moisture longer. There she might find arnica, golden seal, and the sticky, pungent pine resin that the apothecary paid decent coin for. It was a risk. The woods were rough, and a woman alone was fair game for gossip or worse. But looking at Jamie's flushed face, Clara knew she had no choice. She packed a small sack with a knife, a water skin, and a few strips of dried meat. She strapped Jamie to her chest using a long woven shawl, binding him close so his weight would not throw her off balance on the steep trails. She walked through the outskirts of town to reach the trail, keeping her head down. As she passed the back of the Golden Nugget Saloon, the smell of stale beer and sawdust drifted out the open door. Voices floated on the hot air. "I am telling you," one man said, his voice rough with tobacco. "Calder owns more fence posts than there are stars in the sky. He bought out the Miller spread yesterday. Just swallowed it whole." Another voice laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Swallowed it? He stole it. That man is a wolf in a waistcoat. He would fence the air we breathe if he could figure out a way to brand it. He pays fair wages," the first man argued. "My cousin rides for the Circle C, says Calder is hard as granite, but he does not cheat a man on his pay. He is a robber baron," the second man spat. "A king without a crown, and kings do not care who they step on." Clara hurried past, her heart beating a little faster. Eli Calder. The name was a shadow that stretched across the entire valley. She had never seen him close up. Only a dark figure on a black horse riding through town, as if he owned the very dust his hooves kicked up. People said he owned half the state, that he had influence with judges and senators, that he had a past written in blood from the range wars 10 years ago. She shivered despite the heat. Men like Calder were like the weather, powerful, indifferent, and capable of ruining a life without even noticing. She wanted nothing to do with them. She just wanted to survive. The trail up into the foothills was steep and dusty, winding through scrub oak and juniper before climbing into the true forest. As Clara ascended, the air changed. The oppressive stillness of the town gave way to the sound of wind moving through millions of needles. The scent of baking earth was replaced by the sharp, clean smell of pine and dry sap. Jamie slept against her chest, the rhythm of her walking lulling him. Clara focused on the ground, her eyes scanning for the shapes of valuable leaves. She found a patch of yarrow near a dry creek bed and spent 20 minutes carefully harvesting the stalks, shaking the dirt from the roots before placing them in her sack. She climbed higher, driven by the need for resin. The best resin came from the old scars on the giant ponderosa pines, the ones that grew deep in the timber where the shadows were long and cool. The forest here was ancient and vast. The trees were massive columns of rust-colored bark, rising straight up to a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled pools. But even here, the drought had left its mark. The ground was carpeted in a thick layer of brown needles that snapped like glass under her boots. The underbrush was gray and brittle. A single spark, she thought. Just a single spark. She pushed the thought away. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. As she worked a hardened lump of amber sap from a tree trunk, she heard voices. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the bark. The sound came from a ridge above her, carried on the downdraft. It was the heavy rumble of a wagon and the coarse shouting of men, loggers. She knew the timber company had a camp 10 miles north, but they were cutting closer to town this season. She pressed herself against the tree, instinctively hiding. A woman alone in the woods was a curiosity. A woman alone with a baby was a target for questions she did not want to answer. Through the gaps in the trees, she saw them. 3 men stood near a wagon piled high with felled timber. They were rough-looking sorts, their clothes stiff with grease and sweat. They were taking a break, passing a bottle between them. One of them, a man with a beard like a wire brush, tossed a lit cigarette onto the ground. He crushed it with his heel, but the casual carelessness of it made Clara's stomach turn. "This brush is thick," one of the men said, gesturing to the tangle of dry scrub around them. "It is going to take us a month to clear a road to the upper ridge." The man beside him, younger and leaning on an axe, shrugged. "We are not paid by the hour. We are paid by the footage." A third man spoke then, his back to Clara. He was dressed better than the others, in a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. "Boss says he wants this valley opened up by October. He says a good fire might clear these hills faster than axes." The bearded man laughed nervously. "You are joking. A fire in this dry spell? It would burn clean to Wyoming." "Maybe," the man in the coat said. "Or maybe it just burns what needs burning." Clara stopped breathing. The metallic tang of fear tasted sour in her mouth. They could not be serious. To set a fire on purpose, with the wind blowing like this, with the town down in the valley, it was madness. She waited until they climbed back onto their wagon and rumbled away up the logging road. Only then did she peel herself away from the tree. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed to get down. She needed to get back to the safety of her shack, rent or no rent. She turned and began to descend, moving faster than she should have. Jamie woke and let out a small, confused whimper. "Hush," Clara whispered, her hand cupping the back of his head. "We are going home." She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she smelled it. At first, it was faint, ghosting through the scent of pine resin, a dull, acrid odor like old campfires. Clara paused, sniffing the air. The wind had shifted. It was picking up, swirling through the treetops with a sound like rushing water. Then the birds stopped singing. It was a sudden, terrifying silence, followed instantly by an explosion of motion. A flock of crows burst from the canopy overhead, cawing wildly, winging south. A squirrel skittered down a trunk and bolted across the path, ignoring her completely. Clara looked back the way she had come. Through the trees, perhaps a mile uphill, a gray curtain was rising. It was not mist. It was smoke, thick and darker at the bottom, churning as it climbed into the white sky. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach expanded, filling her throat. The fire was already burning, and it was between her and the high ridge. She turned to run downhill, toward the town, but as she rounded a bend in the trail, she skidded to a halt. Below her, in the ravine that led back to the main road, orange light flickered. The wind, unpredictable and cruel, had carried embers over her head, igniting the dry grass in the gully below. The fire was not just behind her, it was ahead of her. "Oh God," she breathed. She looked left, toward the rocky slopes of the canyon wall. It was steep, treacherous ground, but it was the only way that wasn't choked with smoke. She hiked her skirts and ran. The heat rose with terrifying speed. It was no longer the passive heat of the sun. It was a living, breathing thing that pushed against her skin. The air grew thick and hazy, stinging her eyes, making them water so badly she could barely see her footing. Jamie began to scream. It was a high, thin wail of distress that cut through the roar of the wind. I know, Clara gasped, coughing. She pulled the shawl up over his head, pressing his face into the hollow of her shoulder to filter the air. She scrambled up a scree slope, the loose rocks shifting under her worn boots. She slipped, her knees slamming into the gravel. Pain shot up her legs, and she felt the warm trickle of blood on her palms where the sharp stones had sliced the skin. She did not look at them. She scrambled up, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The fire was roaring now. It sounded like a freight train, a deep, resonant bellow that vibrated in the ground. To her right, a pine tree exploded into flames, the needles catching instantly, turning the tree into a torch 50 feet high. The heat hit her like a physical blow, staggering her. She reached a rocky outcrop, a shelf of granite that jutted out from the mountainside. She pulled herself up onto it, collapsing on the flat stone. She crawled to the edge and looked down. Fire. It was a sea of fire. The ravine she had meant to cross was a furnace. The trail she had come down was gone. The flames were climbing the slope toward her, feeding on the dry brush, racing uphill with impossible speed. She looked up the mountain. Wall of smoke. She looked down. Wall of fire. She was trapped. Clara scrambled back against the cliff face, the stone biting into her spine. She curled her body around Jamie, making herself as small as possible. The baby was choking, his small body jerking with coughs. "Please," she whispered, the prayer falling from her cracked lips. "Please, not him." Take me, but not him. She thought of Thomas, of the nights she had hidden in the corner while he raged, wishing for an end to it all. She thought of the town women and their whispers. She thought of the $2 she didn't have. It seemed so small now. All of it seemed so small compared to the monstrous orange wall rushing toward her. This was her punishment. For failing to save Thomas. For failing to be what the town wanted. For daring to come where she didn't belong. She closed her eyes, bowing her head over her son, waiting for the end. The sound of hooves struck the stone. It was a sharp, clattering sound. distinct from the roar of the fire. Clara's head snapped up, bursting through the wall of smoke to her left. A horse appeared. It was a massive black beast, its eyes rolling white with terror, foam lathering its neck and flanks. It danced on the edge of the precipice, shying away from the flames below. On its back was a man. He was a giant of a figure, or perhaps it was just the smoke and the fear magnifying him. He wore a long canvas duster that was singed black at the hem. A hat was pulled low over his eyes, and a scarf was tied tight around the lower half of his face. He spotted her instantly. He didn't hesitate. He spurred the terrified horse forward, forcing the animal across the narrow ledge toward her. The horse screamed, a human sound, but the man held it steady with iron hands. "Get up!" the man roared. His voice was muffled by the scarf but commanded obedience. Clara stared at him, paralyzed. "Move, woman!" The command broke her trance. She scrambled to her feet, clutching Jamie. The man swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, landing heavily in his boots. He stripped a heavy wool blanket from his saddle roll. He uncorked a canteen and dumped the water over the blanket, soaking it in seconds. He stepped toward her, and for a fleeting second, Clara saw his eyes above the scarf. They were gray, dark as storm clouds, and hard with focus. "Give me the boy," he ordered. Clara recoiled instinctively, clutching Jamie tighter. No, he didn't argue. He simply stepped forward, grabbed her shoulder with a grip that bruised, and threw the wet blanket over both her and the child. "Then hold on to him," he growled, "and do not let go." He grabbed Clara by the waist. She gasped as he lifted her as easily as she lifted a basket of laundry, and swung her up onto the saddle. "Stay low. Keep your head down." He swung up behind her. The saddle was cramped, and Clara was forced forward against the horse's sweating neck. She felt the man's chest press against her back, solid and unyielding. His arms came around her, gathering the reins. "Yeah!" The horse leaped forward. They didn't go back the way he had come. He turned the animal straight up a narrow, rocky defile that looked impassable. The horse scrambled, hooves striking sparks against the granite. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pressing Jamie's face into the wet wool of the blanket. The heat was intense, a physical weight that seemed to crush the air out of her lungs. She could hear the fire snapping at the heels of the horse. They crested the ridge and plunged down the other side. The smoke here was thicker, a blinding gray fog. Clara had no idea where they were going. She only knew that the man behind her seemed to know every stone, every twist of the land. "Left!" he shouted to the horse, guiding it with his knees and his weight. They slid down a loose slope of shale, the horse sitting back on its haunches, sliding almost like a skier. Clara felt the animal stumble, its front knees buckling. She screamed as the world tilted. They were going to fall. The man's arm tightened around her waist like a steel band, holding her in the saddle. He hauled back on the reins, shouting to the horse, a guttural sound of encouragement and demand. "Easy, damn you, up, up." The horse found its footing, surging back up, trembling violently. "He is hurt," Clara cried out, her voice lost in the wind. "Leave him! We have to run!" "No!" the man shouted back, his voice right at her ear. "I do not leave my own behind." He drove the horse forward again, but slower now, navigating a maze of fallen timber and boulders. The air was getting hotter again. The fire had jumped the ridge. It was flanking them. "We cannot outrun it," Clara yelled. "I know." He hauled the horse to a halt. They were at the edge of a creek bed. Dry creek. Clara recognized it vaguely, but it wasn't dry here. A small, stagnant pool of water remained in the deepest part of the channel, sheltered by an overhang of rock. "Down," he barked. He dropped from the saddle and pulled Clara down. Her legs gave way when she hit the ground, but he held her up. He slapped the horse's flank hard. "Go, get on!" The horse bolted downstream, away from the smoke. The man dragged Clara toward the water. It was shallow, barely a foot deep, and muddy, but it was water. "Get in!" He shoved her down into the mud and muck. Clara gasped as the cold slime soaked her dress. She curled around Jamie, who was screaming again. The roar of the fire was deafening now. Like 1,000 trains, the sky above the ravine turned a violent, blood-red violet. The man dropped into the water beside her. He grabbed the wet blanket she was still clutching and threw it over her head, tending it. Then, he did something that made Clara's heart stop. He moved over her. He lay half on top of her, his large frame covering hers, shielding her and the baby with his own body. "Stay down," he yelled. "Do not move." The fire hit. It didn't burn them, but it sucked the air right out of the ravine. A blast of heat, hotter than anything Clara had ever imagined, rolled over them. It felt as if they were inside an oven. The wet blanket hissed as the water turned to steam. Clara lay curled in the mud, clutching her son. Above her, the man was heavy and still. She could feel the rapid hammering of his heart against her back. She could feel the tension in his muscles, hard as iron. In that terrifying closeness, with the world ending around them. Clara was flooded with sensations that had no name. Terror, yes, but also a profound, overwhelming gratitude. And something else, a strange, jarring awareness of him. The smell of him, sweat, leather, horses, and smoke. The heat of his body, distinct from the fire. The sheer, brute strength of him interposing himself between her and death. She had spent months shrinking away from men, flinching at their voices. But this weight pressing her into the mud did not feel like violence. It felt like a fortress. She reached out blindly with one hand, gripping the sleeve of his coat. He didn't pull away. The roar reached a crescendo, a screaming pitch that vibrated her teeth, and then, slowly, it began to recede. The heat lingered, suffocating and intense. But the sound of the wind changed. The main front of the fire had jumped the creek. They lay there for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes. The man's breathing was harsh and ragged. Finally, he stirred. He shifted his weight off her, groaning low in his throat. He pulled the blanket back. Clara blinked up at him. The sky was an eerie, bruised orange. Ash fell like black snow, coating everything. The trees on the opposite bank were black skeletons, glowing with red embers in their branches. The man pulled the scarf down from his face. He had a strong face, lined by sun and wind, with a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from the granite of the mountains. He was soot-stained, his eyebrows singed, a smear of blood on his forehead. Eli Calder. She recognized him now from the descriptions. The robber baron. The wolf. He looked at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her face, then down to the bundle in her arms. "Is the boy breathing?" he asked. His voice was raspy, wrecked by smoke. Clara looked down. Jamie was quiet, his face red and streaked with tears and soot, but his chest was rising and falling steadily. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Eli nodded. Once, sharp and efficient. He sat back in the mud, wiping a hand across his face. He looked exhausted, but the authority was still there, coiled in his shoulders. "We cannot stay here," he said. The wind could shift back. Clara tried to stand, but her legs were trembling so violently they wouldn't support her. She slumped back against the muddy bank. I have to go back to town," she stammered. "My house. The road to town is gone," Eli said, cutting her off. "It is a wall of fire by now, and even if you could get there, the smoke will be choking the valley floor." He stood up, swaying slightly, then steadied himself. He reached a hand down to her. It was a large hand, calloused and rough. "My ranch is on the high plateau to the west," he said. "The fire is moving east. The air will be clear there." Clara stared at his hand. She thought of the whispers in town. She thought of the reputation of the man who owned half the state. Going with him meant ruining whatever shred of reputation she had left. But then she looked at the blackened forest around them. She looked at Jamie. She reached up and took his hand. His grip was firm, pulling her up out of the mud. "Come on," Eli Calder said. "It is a long walk." He kept his hand on her elbow, supporting her as they began to stumble through the smoking ruin of the world, heading toward the only safety left. The Calder Ranch was not merely a piece of property. It was a kingdom carved from the granite and hard-packed earth of the Colorado high country. It sat on a plateau that rose above the smoking ruin of the lower valley, a vast table of land where the wind blew uninterrupted from the peaks of the Rockies to the plains of Kansas. The main house was a fortress of native stone and rough-hewn timber, anchored to the earth as if it had grown there alongside the twisted cottonwoods that lined the dry creek bed. Beyond the house, the barns rose like cathedrals of commerce, red-painted wood fading to a dusty pink under the relentless sun. Corrals stretched out in a complex geometry of split-rail fencing, holding horses that dozed with their tails flicking at flies. Further out, the land opened into an ocean of yellow grass, parched and shimmering in the heat, broken only by the distant, dark islands of cattle herds moving slowly in search of water. Men rode the fence lines, solitary figures silhouetted against a white-hot sky, trailing clouds of dust that hung in the air long after they had passed. Clara Hayes woke to the smell of lavender and starch. It was a scent so foreign to her life of lye soap and wood smoke that for a long moment she kept her eyes closed, convinced she was dreaming. The mattress beneath her was soft, swallowing her tired body, and the sheets were cool, smooth linen that whispered against her skin. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was high, crossed with heavy dark beams. Sunlight filtered through thick velvet curtains, casting a golden haze over a room that was larger than her entire shack in Ash Creek. There was a heavy oak wardrobe, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher, and a polished mirror that reflected a woman she barely recognized, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, her hair loose and tangled on the pillow. She tried to push herself up, and a sharp hiss of pain escaped her lips. Her hands were bandaged. Thick white gauze was wrapped expertly around her palms and fingers. Memory crashed into her like a physical blow. The fire, the heat, the man on the black horse, Jamie! The name tore from her throat as she scrambled upright, ignoring the stinging in her hands. He is sleeping, ma'am. The voice was deep and came from the corner of the room. Clara froze, clutching the sheet to her chest. In the shadows of the room, seated in a high-backed leather chair, was Eli Calder. He was not wearing the duster or the scarf now. He wore a clean white shirt, open at the collar, and a dark vest. His hat rested on his knee, his large hands resting idly on the brim. He looked different without the layer of soot and desperation, older, perhaps, with silver threading through the dark hair at his temples and lines of fatigue carved deep around his mouth. He nodded toward the foot of the bed. Clara followed his gaze. There, in a wooden cradle that looked as if it had been dragged down from an attic, Jamie slept soundly. One small fist was curled against his cheek. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She looked from the baby to the man, her mind racing with the terrible logic of the poor. She was in a rich man's house, in a rich man's bed. She was a widow with nothing, and he was a man who owned everything. She knew what the world called women who accepted such charity. She knew what prices were often exacted for such comfort. "What is this?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but sharp. "Am I a prisoner here?" Eli blinked, seemingly taken aback by the accusation. He stood up slowly, unfolding his height until he loomed over the room. He did not step closer. However, he stayed by the chair, respecting the distance. "You are a guest, Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "You and the boy. You took in a lot of smoke yesterday. My foreman, Sam, brought the cradle down from the loft. We have not had a baby in this house for a long time." Clara swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She was wearing a nightgown that was not her own, a fine, white cotton thing with lace at the cuffs. The realization made her face burn with shame. "Where are my clothes?" she demanded. "I need to leave. I need to take my son and go." Eli turned slightly, gesturing to the window. "Look outside." Clara hesitated, then stood. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to hold her. She walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. She gasped. To the east, where the town of Ash Creek lay, the world had disappeared. A wall of gray and black smoke stood like a thunderhead. solid and imposing, blotting out the mountains and the sun. The sky above it was a bruised purple. Even here, miles away and upwind, the glass of the window was warm to the touch. "The road is gone," Eli said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The bridge at Sweetwater Crossing burned out last night. The valley floor is an oven. If you go down there now, you will not make it 3 miles before the smoke takes you." Clara stared at the devastation. It looked like the end of the world. She turned back to Eli, her defiance crumbling into a cold, hard knot of fear. "So we are trapped," she whispered. Eli turned his hat in his hands. "You are safe." "That is the word I would use. The fire is moving east, away from us. You will stay here until the road opens and the air clears." Clara stiffened. She pulled the borrowed wrapper tighter around herself. "Mr. Calder, I know who you are. The whole territory knows who you are. I am a washerwoman. I have $2 to my name, and I lost my house yesterday. I cannot pay you for this, and I will not." She trailed off, her chin lifting, her eyes flashing with a desperate pride. "I will not be kept. I will not have people saying I traded my honor for a soft bed." Eli looked at her for a long moment. A strange expression crossed his face. Not anger, as she expected, but a flicker of amusement, followed quickly by a profound sadness. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice low. "I brought you here because I would not leave a dog to die in that fire, let alone a woman and child. I expect nothing from you. I will work," Clara insisted, cutting him off. "If I stay, I work. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend, but I will not take charity." Eli studied her. He saw the trembling of her hands, the exhaustion in her posture, and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "My cook, Mrs. Gable, has rheumatism in her knees. She could use help in the kitchen, and there is plenty of mending to be done. The boys are hard on their clothes." "Thank you," Clara said, the word stiff. Eli placed his hat on his head, tipping the brim slightly. "Rest today. You start tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. That night, Eli stood in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he had not touched for 20 minutes. The room was dark, lit only by the fireplace where a few logs burned, not for warmth, for the night was hot, but because Eli found it impossible to sit in a room without a fire when his mind was this dark. The events of the previous day had peeled back the scabs on wounds he thought had healed a decade ago. The smell of the smoke, the sound of the wind roaring through the pines, the heat, it all brought him back to the winter of 1878. He had been younger then, hungrier. The range war had been in full swing. He had wanted the water rights to the upper basin, and he had pushed hard against the squatters living there. He had hired men to scare them out. Just to scare. He had told them, burn a barn, spook the cattle. But the fire they set had caught the wind. It had jumped to the main cabin. Elizabeth had been inside. She was the daughter of the man he was fighting. A woman Eli had been courting in secret. A woman who had begged him to make peace. She had gone back to get her father's ledger. He remembered the way the roof had collapsed. He remembered the sound of his own screaming as his men held him back. Eli looked into the fireplace now, watching the flames lick at the oak log. He had built this empire, this sanctuary of stone and land, to bury that memory. He had fenced off half the state to ensure that no one could ever touch him or his again. But the fire didn't care about fences. He looked down at his hands. They were clean, scrubbed of soot, but he felt the stain of ash on them. He was a man built on ruin. He had no business bringing a woman like Clara Hayes into this house. She was innocent in a way he had never been, struggling for a clean life while he sat on a throne of guilt. He tossed the whiskey into the fire. The flames roared up, blue and angry, and Eli turned away. Dinner the next evening was an ordeal of silence and clattering silverware. They ate in the main dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a table long enough to seat 20 men. Tonight, it was occupied only by 3, Eli at the head, his foreman Sam to his right, and Clara to his left. Clara had dressed in the only clothes she had, her work dress, washed and dried by Mrs. gable, but still faded and frayed at the hem. She felt small and drab against the dark wood and leather of the room. Sam was a man carved from the same rough material as Eli, but older, with a face like a dried apple and a mustache that drooped over his mouth. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel. "The beef is good tonight," Sam said, his voice gravelly. Eli nodded, cutting his steak. "It is." Clara kept her eyes on her plate. She was acutely aware of her bandaged hands, which made holding the fork difficult. Every time the silverware clicked against the china, it sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Jamie, who was sitting in a makeshift high chair constructed from a stack of books on a regular chair, let out a loud squeal. He banged a wooden spoon against the table. Clara flinched. "Hush, Jamie." The baby ignored her, winding up for another strike. "Allow me," Eli said, before Clara could protest. Eli reached over. He did not take the spoon away. Instead, he scooped Jamie up with one arm, settling the baby into the crook of his elbow. Clara stopped breathing. She watched, terrified and mesmerized, as the man who terrified the entire county held her son. Eli's hands were massive against the infant's ribs. His fingers were scarred, the knuckles swollen from years of fighting and work, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He shifted the baby so Jamie could see the room. "You have a strong grip, little one," Eli murmured. Jamie stared up at Eli, fascinated by the silver watch chain hanging from his vest. He reached out with a chubby, dimpled hand and grasped Eli's thumb. Eli froze. He looked down at the tiny fingers wrapped around his own. His face, usually a mask of stoic indifference, softened. The lines around his eyes smoothed out. For a second, he looked younger. He looked human. Clara felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was a sharp, sudden ache. To see her son, who had no father, resting so comfortably in the arms of this powerful, dangerous man. It confused her. It made her want to weep, and it made her want to run. "He likes you," Sam observed, chewing slowly. "That is a rare judge of character. Usually, children run from you." "Boss?" Eli cleared his throat, the softness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He carefully placed Jamie back on his chair. "He is just curious," Eli said gruffly. After dinner, Clara took Jamie to bed, but the heat of the house was stifling. She wandered out onto the veranda, a wide wooden porch that wrapped around the house. Eli was there, leaning against the railing, smoking a cheroot. The glowing tip was a single red eye in the darkness. He did not turn as she approached, but she knew he heard her. "The wind has died down," he said. Clara stopped a few feet away. She looked out at the horizon. The fires were still burning on the distant ridges, long necklaces of orange light draped across the black mountains. The moon was up, but it was choked by smoke, appearing as a dull, blood-red coin in the sky. "It is beautiful," Clara said, the words slipping out before she could check them, in a terrible way. "The land is always beautiful," Eli said, "and it is always cruel. It gives you grass one year and fire the next. It gives you gold in the river and then buries you in a mine collapse. It takes everything you have. Mrs. Hayes, if you let it, I know," Clara said softly. "My husband, the land did not take him. The bottle did, but the land took everything else. It took my hope." Eli turned to look at her. In the dim light, his eyes were unreadable. "You still have the boy, and you have your stubbornness. I saw you in that canyon. You do not give up easily. I have no choice," she said. "We always have a choice," Eli countered. "Even if the choice is just how we stand when the fire comes." Before Clara could answer, the sound of galloping hooves broke the quiet. A rider emerged from the gloom, his horse loping tiredly toward the main house. Eli straightened up, flicking his cheroot into the dust. Sam came out of the front door, a rifle in the crook of his arm. The rider pulled up at the porch steps. It was a young hand named Shorty, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "Boss!" Shorty gasped, sliding from the saddle. "Report." Eli said. Shorty took a gulp of air. The fire took out the Miller homestead and the creeping line north of the gorge. Half the timber on the lower slopes is gone. And the town? Chaos. Shorty said. The mayor is screaming for help. Folks are sleeping in the creek bed. But? Shorty hesitated, glancing at Clara. Go on, Eli commanded. I rode past the timber company land. Shorty said. The logging camp. Their main piles, the big stacks of cut timber near the road, they are untouched. Eli went very still. Untouched? Yes, sir. The fire burned right up to the firebreak and stopped. It is unnatural. It is like the brush was cleared back 100 yards just before the sparks flew. Eli's jaw tightened. A fire that wild does not respect a firebreak unless it was guided, unless someone knew exactly where it was going to start. Clara felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She pressed her hand to her mouth. The voices of the men in the forest echoed in her mind. A good fire might clear these hills faster than axes. She took a breath to speak. She needed to tell him. She needed to say, I heard them. I saw them. But then she looked at Eli, a man of power, a man who spoke of choices and cruelty. And she looked at Shorty and Sam, men with guns and hard faces. Who would believe her? A washerwoman with a dead drunk for a husband, lodging on charity? If she spoke, and she was wrong, or if she spoke and the timber company came after her. She thought of Jamie sleeping upstairs. She closed her mouth, swallowing the truth. The guilt tasted like ash on her tongue. Get some food. Shorty, Eli said, his voice cold. We ride at dawn to check the perimeter. The days that followed fell into a strange, suspended rhythm. The world outside remained a haze of smoke and heat, but inside the ranch house, life was ordered and quiet. Clara worked. She worked with a ferocity that surprised Mrs. Gable. She scrubbed the floors until the wood paled. She took over the mending basket, her needle flashing through torn denim and flannel with practiced speed. She refused to sit idle for even a moment. Jamie became the center of the household's orbit. He was a bright spot in the grim, masculine atmosphere. He crawled across the Persian rugs in the parlor, babbling at the dust motes. And slowly, inevitably, Eli was drawn in. It happened in small moments. Clara would be in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, and she would turn to find Eli standing in the doorway, watching her with a look of intense, quiet hunger, not for food, but for the scene itself. One afternoon, he found Jamie trying to pull himself up on the leg of a heavy oak table. Eli set his hat aside and sat on the floor, actually sat on the rug, and held out his hands. Come on, then, he said softly. Stand tall. Jamie gripped Eli's fingers and pulled himself up, crowing with triumph. Eli laughed, a deep, rusty sound that seemed to startle even him. Clara, watching from the hallway, felt her heart turn over in her chest. Later that week, Eli found Clara staring longingly at the horses in the corral. Do you ride? He asked. I used to, she said, before, saddle the gray mare. Eli told Sam. He took her out to the near pasture. The mare was gentle, moving with a rocking chair gait. Clara felt clumsy at first, her skirts bunching, her balance off. But Eli rode beside her on his massive black gelding. He was patient, his voice low and steady. Keep your heels down, he instructed. Let your hips move with her. That is it. He rode close, too close for propriety. Perhaps, his leg brushed against hers, when the mare shied at a rabbit. Clara gasped and grabbed the pommel. Eli's hand shot out, covering hers on the reins. His grip was warm and solid. I have you, he said. You're safe. Clara looked at him. They were alone in the field, surrounded by the dry, whispering grass. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. She could smell the scent of tobacco and soap on his skin. She did not pull her hand away. For a moment, she didn't want to be safe. She wanted to be closer. The tension broke only when the wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face. The weather turned 2 days later. It wasn't rain, it was wind. A true high plains gale that screamed down from the mountains, picking up the loose topsoil and turning the air into a brown blizzard. Clara was in the parlor when the shutters banged open. The wind roared into the house, knocking a vase off the mantel and sending papers swirling. Jamie started crying. "Mrs. Gable!" Clara shouted, running to the window. Eli burst into the room from the study. "Get the shutters!" he yelled over the wind. He grabbed one side of the heavy wooden shutter, fighting the gale. Clara grabbed the other. The wind was incredibly strong, pushing against them with the force of a physical hand. Grit stung Clara's face, blinding her. "Push!" Eli roared. They shoved together, leaning their weight into the wood. The shutter slammed closed, and Eli threw the latch. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Clara stumbled back, off balance. She would have fallen, but Eli caught her. He grabbed her by the waist, his hands spanning her ribs. She grabbed his forearms to steady herself. They stood there, chest to chest, breathing hard. The room was dim, the dust hanging in the air like gold powder. Clara looked up at him. His hair was disheveled, his eyes dark and intense. The adrenaline of the struggle was still coursing through her veins, mixing with something else, something hot and undeniable. She felt the heat of his body through her thin dress. She saw his gaze drop to her lips, then back to her eyes. He wanted her. She saw it as clearly as she saw the fire on the mountain. And God help her, she wanted him. She wanted to lean into him, to bury her face in his neck and forget that she was a washerwoman and he was a king. Eli, she breathed, the name slipping out without a title. His hands tightened on her waist. He leaned in, just an inch. Then, from the kitchen, a door slammed, and Mrs. Gable's voice called out, "Is everyone all right?" Eli pulled back as if he had been burned. He dropped his hands, stepping away, his face closing down into a mask of iron control. "We are fine, Mrs. Gable," he called out, his voice rough. "Just the wind." He looked at Clara one last time, a look of apology and longing, and turned on his heel, retreating into his study. The windstorm passed, but the air in the house remained charged. Clara moved through the rooms like a ghost, her nerves frayed. The next morning, she was shaking out rugs near the bunkhouse. The wind was carrying voices from around the corner where two of the ranch hands were repairing a harness. "I am telling you," one voice said. It was a new hand, a man Clara didn't know well. "The boss has gone soft, keeping a stray woman in the big house. She is a looker." Though, the second man laughed. "You cannot blame a man for wanting a warm bed during a cold spell." The first man snorted. "It is not decent. Folks in town are already talking. They say she is a ruined woman now. They say she is trading favors for that roof over her head. And Calder, he is just collecting strays. He will tire of her soon enough. He always rides alone in the end." Clara stood frozen, the rug heavy in her hands. The shame was a cold bucket of water dumped over her head. Ruined. Trading favors. It was exactly what she had feared. It was exactly what she had told herself wouldn't happen. She had let herself get comfortable. She had let herself play house. She had let herself look at Eli Calder and see a man instead of a master. And the town knew. Her reputation, already tattered by Thomas, was now shredded beyond repair. She dropped the rug and ran back to the house, tears stinging her eyes. She dashed up the stairs, ignoring Mrs. Gable's question, and burst into her room. She grabbed her canvas sack. She began to stuff her few belongings into it. She had to leave. The road must be passable by now. She would walk if she had to. She would carry Jamie over the mountains. She would go anywhere that wasn't here. Anywhere where she wasn't a rich man's whore in the eyes of the world. Downstairs, Eli stood in the hallway. He had seen her run past, seen the tears on her face. He clenched his fists at his sides. He knew what people were saying. He had heard the whispers himself, and he had fired a man yesterday for speaking disrespectfully of her. But he couldn't stop the world from talking, and he couldn't stop the voice in his own head that told him they were right about one thing. He was using her. He was using her presence to pretend he was a decent man, to pretend he could have a family, a life that wasn't built on blood. He wanted to go up those stairs. He wanted to tell her that he didn't care about the town, that he wanted her to stay forever, but he didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the conviction that he, Eli Calder, the man who had burned his own happiness to the ground 10 years ago, did not deserve anything as gentle as Clara Hayes. He heard Jamie laugh upstairs, a pure, innocent sound. Eli closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cool plaster of the wall. "Let her go," he told himself. "If she tries to leave, let her go. It is the only decent thing you can do." But even as he thought it, he knew that if she walked out that door, the silence she left behind would be louder than any storm. The descent from the high plateau was a journey through a graveyard. Eli Calder drove the buckboard wagon, his hands loose but ready on the leather reins. Beside him, Clara Hayes sat stiffly, Jamie asleep in the crook of her arm, wrapped against the wind that swept down from the peaks. They did not speak. There were no words for the devastation that lay on either side of the road. The fire had been a living thing, a voracious beast that had eaten the heart out of the valley. Where there had once been stands of green pine and golden aspen, there was now only charcoal. The hillsides were stripped bare, reduced to ash-gray slopes punctuated by the blackened, skeletal fingers of dead trees. The ground was scorched down to the mineral earth. Here and there, the carcass of a deer or a coyote lay bloated and stiff, caught by the flames before they could run. It was a silence so profound it pressed against Clara's eardrums. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to mourn, whistling hollowly through the burned stumps. Eli kept his eyes on the road, navigating the ruts and washouts caused by the sudden lack of vegetation to hold the soil. His face was grim, set in lines of hard granite. He knew this land. He knew the years it would take to heal, the scars that would remain long after he was in the ground. When they finally rolled into Ash Creek, the air tasted of wet soot. The town had survived, spared by a shift in the wind and the desperate fire breaks dug by the townsfolk, but it wore the grime of the disaster like a mourning veil. Eli pulled the wagon up to the edge of town, near the alley that led to Clara's shack. "I will wait here," he said. Clara nodded, handing Jamie to him without thinking. It was a testament to the strange days at the ranch that the gesture felt natural. She climbed down, her boots kicking up dust that was darker than before. She walked down the narrow path, her heart lifting slightly at the thought of her own 4 walls. It was a poor place, drafty and small, but it was hers. It was the one place where she answered to no one. She rounded the corner and stopped dead. The door to her shack was open. A man was sitting on the stoop, whittling a stick. He was a stranger, a miner by the look of his worn canvas pants and heavy boots. Inside, she could hear a woman singing a bawdy tune. Clara stepped forward, her hands clenching into fists. "What are you doing here?" The man looked up, squinting. "Who are you? I live here," Clara said, her voice rising. "This is my house." The man laughed. A dry, hacking sound. "Not anymore. Lady, Henderson rented it to us yesterday. Said the previous tenant ran off and abandoned it." "Abandoned?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "I did not abandon it. I was trapped by the fire." "Tell it to Henderson," the man said, turning back to his whittling. "He took our money. $3 for the month. Unless you can top that, you best keep moving." Clara stood there, the world tilting on its axis. $3. She did not have $3. She did not even have 3 cents. Her landlord had not waited to see if she was alive or dead. He had simply sold her home to the first person with coin in his pocket. She turned and ran back to the main street, her skirts kicking up the ash. She found Mr. Henderson coming out of the barber shop, smelling of bay rum and tonic. He stopped when he saw her, his face flushing a mottled red. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, adjusting his collar. "We thought you were dead." "You rented my house," Clara accused, her voice trembling. "My things are inside. My husband's Bible, my son's blanket. I put them in a box behind the shed," Henderson said, refusing to meet her eyes. "Look, Mrs. Hayes, business is business. A house cannot sit empty with so many folks displaced by the fire. I had to make a living." You stole my home, Clara whispered. Henderson's eyes hardened. Your rent was due on the 1st. You were not here to pay it. Now, if you will excuse me. He pushed past her. Clara stood in the middle of the street, the sun beating down on her bonnet, feeling a coldness that went marrow deep. She had nothing. She walked back to the wagon. Eli saw her face and stiffened. What happened? He asked, his voice low. Someone else is in the house, Clara said, taking Jamie back from him. Her arms felt heavy, as if the baby weighed 100 pounds. Henderson rented it out. He said I abandoned it. Eli's hands tightened on the reins until the leather creaked. I will have a word with Mr. Henderson? No, Clara said sharply. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. No, you cannot fight my battles for me. Eli, if you go over there and threaten him, everyone will say I set you on him like a guard dog. I have to find another way. She turned and began to walk toward the center of town. Eli did not leave. He clicked his tongue to the horses and followed her, the wagon rolling slowly at her pace, a dark shadow at her shoulder. People were watching. Ash Creek was not a large town, and news traveled faster than the wind. As Clara walked down the boardwalk, clutching Jamie, heads turned. Men paused in their conversations outside the saloon. Women sweeping their porches stopped and leaned on their brooms, whispering behind their hands. Look at her, she heard a voice hiss, riding in with him like she is the lady of the manor. They say she was up there a week. Another voice answered, alone in that big house with him. We all know what that means. Her husband barely cold in the ground, and she is already warming another man's bed. And a man like Calder, too. Shameful. Clara kept her head high, staring straight ahead, but the words struck her like stones. She felt naked, exposed. Every glance felt like an accusation. She reached the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The scent of coffee beans and dry goods usually comforted her, but today the air felt stale. Mr. O'Malley stood behind the counter. He was a round man who had always been kind enough to give Jamie a stick of peppermint when she had a penny to spare. Mr. O'Malley, Clara said, stepping up to the counter. The storekeeper looked at her, then looked past her. Through the window where Eli sat in the wagon, he shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on his apron. Mrs. Hayes, good to see you made it through. I need a few things, Clara said, and I was hoping I could put them on account, just until I can find wash work. Henderson rented my shack, and I need to find a room at the boarding house. O'Malley looked down at the ledger open on the counter. He closed it with a soft thump. I cannot do it, Mrs. Hayes. Clara blinked. But I have always paid, even when Thomas was, even before, I always settled up. I know, O'Malley said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But things are tight. The timber company, they supply most of my dry goods now. They have been squeezing credit all over town. And, well... And what? Clara asked. And it would not look right, O'Malley said, his face reddening. Giving credit to a woman in your position, folks might talk. They might say I am supporting immorality. Clara felt as if he had slapped her. Immorality. Because she had survived. Because a man had saved her life. She turned and walked out, the bell jingling its mockery behind her. She tried the church next. The ladies of the auxiliary were gathered in the rectory, sorting clothes for the fire victims. Mrs. Gable's sister, a stern woman named Mrs. Higgins, looked up as Clara entered. Mrs. Higgins, Clara said, I have nowhere to stay. Henderson took the house. I need a bed for tonight, just for the baby. I can sleep on the floor. Mrs. Higgins pursed her lips. She looked at Jamie, then at Clara's travel-stained dress. We are full up. Clara, she said, the fire families have taken every cot. Please, Clara begged. It is going to be cold tonight. Mrs. Higgins sighed, folding a pair of trousers with sharp, angry motions. Why do you not go back to your friend? She asked, the word dripping with venom. Mr. Calder seems to have taken quite an interest in your welfare. I am sure he has plenty of beds. I want to stay here, Clara said. I want to be with decent people. Then you should have thought of that before you spent the week playing house on the hill. Mrs. Higgins snapped. Go back to him. Clara, do what is necessary. It seems you have already started down that path anyway. Clara backed out of the room, her chest heaving. She stumbled out onto the street. The sun was high and brutal. The dust choked her. She stood in the middle of the road, hugging Jamie, feeling the walls of the town closing in. She was trapped. She had no money, no home, and no name. They had taken her reputation and left her with nothing but hunger and shame. Well, look who it is. The voice was smooth, like oil on water. Clara looked up. Sheriff Dawes stood on the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was a lean man with a face that was too handsome, his eyes pale and empty like glass marbles. He wore a star on his vest that shone too brightly. Sheriff, Clara said, clutching Jamie tighter. Dawes stepped down into the street, his spurs jingling. Behind him, 2 deputies leaned against the post, grinning. We were wondering when you would show up, Dawes said. There has been talk, lots of talk, about you and the Cattle King. There is nothing to talk about. Clara said, he saved my life. Is that right? Dawes circled her slowly. Saved your life? And what did you give him in return? I wonder. Men like Eli Calder do not do favors for free. Leave her be. Dawes. The voice came from the wagon. Eli had climbed down. He stood 10 feet away. His coat brushed back to reveal the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. He looked calm, but Clara knew that stillness. It was the calm before a lightning strike. Mr. Calder, Dawes said, smiling without warmth. Welcome back to civilization. I was just telling the little lady here that she should be careful. It is dangerous for a woman of her standing to be associating with a man of yours. Lines get blurred. People get the wrong idea. The only person with the wrong idea here is you, Eli said, stepping closer. Dawes' smile vanished. You think you own this town. Eli, you think because you have a big house and a lot of cows, you can do whatever you want. Take whatever land you want. Take whatever woman you want. Eli's hand twitched near his gun. His eyes went black. Clara saw the violence rising. She saw the way Eli's shoulders bunched, the way Dawes' hand hovered near his own weapon. No, Clara cried out. She stepped between them, turning to face Eli. Her eyes pleaded with him. Please, she whispered. Do not for me. If you hurt him, they will lock you up. They will take Jamie away from me. Please, Eli. Eli looked down at her. He saw the terror in her face. He saw the way she trembled. He took a deep breath, his jaw muscles jumping as he ground his teeth. He forced his hands to relax, though the effort cost him. He looked at Dawes. Stay out of my way, Sheriff, and keep your mouth shut about Mrs. Hayes. Dawes laughed, but he took a half-step back. I am the law here. Calder, remember that. Eli ignored him. He turned to Clara. Get in the wagon, he said. Clara didn't argue. She climbed up, her face burning. Eli swung up beside her and snapped the reins. They rolled out of town, past the staring eyes, past the judgment, past the ruin of her life. They rode in silence for a mile, until the town was just a smudge of smoke behind them. Eli pulled the wagon off the road, into the shade of a lone, surviving cottonwood near the creek. He set the brake and turned to her. You cannot stay there, he said. I have nowhere else, Clara said, staring at her hands. They will eat you alive, Eli said. They have already judged you. Clara, they judged you for Thomas, and now they are judging you for me. If you stay, you will starve, or they will take the boy. Clara began to cry. It was a silent weeping, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. I know, but what can I do? I cannot be what they say I am. Eli took off his hat. He ran a hand through his hair, looking out at the mountains. Come back to the ranch. Clara looked at him sharply. No, you heard them. You heard what Mrs. Higgins said. If I go back there, I am confirming every lie they tell. Not as a guest, Eli said firmly. As an employee. Clara wiped her eyes. What? I need a housekeeper, Eli said. Mrs. Gable is getting old. She cannot manage the big house alone. And I need someone to help with the books. Sam is good with cattle, but he counts on his fingers. You can read and write. You are sharp. He turned to face her fully. I will pay you $20 a month, plus room and board. You will have the guest room for yourself and the boy. You will earn your keep. It will be a job. Clara, just a job. Clara looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deceit. She saw only an earnest, desperate intensity. And, us? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What about us? Eli looked down at his hands. He swallowed hard. Nothing will happen that you do not want to happen, he said. His voice broke on the last word, a crack in the armor that revealed a deep, aching fear of hurting her. I swear it. Clara, I will not touch you. I will not ask anything of you that is not in the job description. You will be safe. Clara looked away, out at the scorched hills. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the way he had used his strength to corner her, the way he had used money to control her. She thought of the drunken nights and the bruises. Then she looked at Eli. She saw the way he sat, giving her space. She remembered his hands on Jamie, gentle and sure. She remembered him riding into the fire. She wanted to go with him. The realization terrified her. It wasn't just safety she wanted, it was him. She wanted the way he looked at her, like she was something precious, not something broken. But she could not be owned. Never again. I will come, she said slowly. Eli let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. Good. But, Clara interrupted, holding up a hand. On one condition, anything. I want a contract, she said. A written contract, stating my wages, stating my duties, and stating that I am free to leave at any time, for any reason, with my son, and... She hesitated, then lifted her chin. And stating that our relationship is strictly professional. Eli stared at her. Surprise widened his eyes, followed by a slow, dawning respect. He nodded. You are a hard woman, Clara Hayes. I have to be. She said, I have paper in my saddlebag. Eli said, we will write it up now. Sam can witness it when we get back. He retrieved a small leather notebook and a pencil. There, under the shade of the cottonwood, with the smell of ash in the air. They drafted the agreement. Eli wrote in a bold, angular hand. Clara read every word, her finger tracing the lines. When it was done, she signed her name, Clara Ann Hayes. Eli signed below her, Eli James Calder. He tore the page out and handed it to her. Keep this. It is your bond. Clara folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her bodice, next to her heart. It felt like armor. Let us go home, she said. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm that was deceptive in its peace. The days were full. Clara took over the household with a quiet efficiency that left Mrs. Gable sputtering with delighted relief. She organized the larder. She mended the linens, and in the evenings, after Jamie was asleep, she sat in the study with Eli in the ledgers. The scale of his holdings staggered her as she tallied the columns of cattle sales, timber rights, and mining shares. She realized the immense weight of the power he wielded. He truly did own half the state, yet he lived simply. He spent his days in the saddle, working alongside his men, coming home covered in the same dust and sweat as the lowliest hand. She learned to read his moods. She learned that when he rubbed his left shoulder, the old bullet wound from the range war was aching. She learned that when he went quiet at dinner, he was worrying about the drought. And he learned her. He learned that she took her coffee black. He learned that she hummed when she was sewing. He respected her mind, asking her opinion on supply orders and listening when she pointed out discrepancies in the feed bills. But it was Jamie who bridged the gap between them. The baby adored Eli. If Eli walked into the room, Jamie's face would light up like a sunrise. One evening, Clara watched as Eli sat in the big leather chair, Jamie standing on his knees. "Where's my hat?" Eli asked. Feigning confusion, Jamie giggled, reaching for the Stetson on Eli's head. He pulled it down over his own eyes. blinding himself. Eli threw his head back and laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent in the big house. He tossed Jamie lightly in the air, the boy shrieking with delight before settling him back on his knee. Clara stood in the doorway, a ledger in her hand, watching them. The ache in her chest was constant now. It was a yearning so sharp, it frightened her. She saw the father Jamie should have had. She saw the man she wanted to know, not as a boss, but as something else. The storm came in late September, a dry electrical storm that battered the mountains with thunder but brought no rain. Clara woke to the sound of booming thunder. She checked on Jamie, who was sleeping through the noise, then threw a shawl over her nightgown and went downstairs. She needed water. She found the front door open. Eli was sitting on the porch steps, leaning against the post, watching the lightning fork across the sky. He turned as she stepped out. The flash of lightning illuminated his face, showing the deep hollows under his eyes. "I did not mean to wake you," he said. "You didn't?" Clara said. "I was thirsty." She hesitated, then walked over and sat on the step next to him. Not touching, but close. The air was charged with the smell of ozone. "It is a dry storm," Eli said. "The worst kind. All fury. No relief. Like this land," Clara said softly. Eli nodded. He took a sip from a tin cup of coffee he was holding. "I used to love storms," he said. Before the fire?" Clara asked. Eli looked at her. It was the first time she had asked directly. "Yes," he said, "before the fire." He was silent for a long time, the thunder rolling away to the south. "Her name was Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough. "Her father was a squatter on the upper range. I wanted his water. I was young, arrogant. I thought the world owed me everything I could take." He looked down into his cup. "I pushed them hard. My men, they went too far. They set a fire to scare them out. But the wind is the only thing you cannot buy." Clara, it shifted. The cabin went up in minutes. She went back in for her father's books. She never came out. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, then settled it gently on his sleeve. "It was not your hand that lit the match, Eli," she whispered. "It was my greed," he said bitterly. "I built this ranch on her ashes. Every acre I own is paid for with her life. That is why why I'm alone. I do not deserve to be happy." Clara looked at his profile, etched in sorrow. "I wished for it," she confessed, the words tumbling out. Eli turned to her. "What? Thomas?" She said. "My husband. He came home one night, drunk, angry because he had lost his wages at the tables. He hit me. He hit me because the baby was crying. I hid in the corner, holding Jamie, and I looked at the kerosene lamp on the table. And I wished I would knock it over. I wished the whole house would burn and take him and me and everything, just so it would stop." A tear slid down her cheek. "Does that make me a monster?" Eli turned fully toward her. He reached out and brushed the tear away with his thumb. His touch was rough, calloused, but incredibly tender. "No," he said fiercely. "It makes you a survivor." They sat there, the air between them vibrating with the storm and their confessions. Eli's hand lingered on her cheek. His eyes dropped to her lips. Clara's breath hitched. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to pull her into the darkness and hold her until the memories stopped screaming. The desire was heavy, frightening in its intensity. It was a storm pressing on her skin. Eli leaned in, his eyes searching hers. "Clara." Clara trembled. She saw the raw need in his eyes, mirroring her own. But then, a flash of lightning illuminated the distant ridges, the jagged line of the burned forest. The memory of the woods crashed back into her mind. The smell of smoke, the voices. She pulled back, gasping. "What is it?" Eli asked, his hand falling away. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. "Eli," she said, "there is something I have to tell you, something I was too afraid to say before." Eli went still. "What is it? The day of the fire?" she whispered. "In the woods. Before the smoke started, I saw men. What men? Loggers. She said, from the timber outfit. They were resting near a wagon. I heard them talking. One of them, a man in a dark coat. He said the boss wanted the valley cleared by October. She looked up at Eli, her eyes wide with fear. He said, a good fire might clear these hills faster than axes. Eli did not move. He did not breathe. He sat frozen on the porch step, staring at her. The silence stretched, heavy and terrible. Then, slowly, the expression on his face changed. The sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly clarity. The fury that simmered under the surface was so palpable, Clara could almost feel the heat of it. Faster than axes, Eli repeated, his voice devoid of all inflection. Clara nodded, and Shorty said the timber piles were untouched, that the fire stopped right at their line. Eli stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch and gripped the railing. His knuckles turned white. It was not an accident. He said it was not the drought. It was Rourke, the timber boss, and if they are clearing the hills, he turned back to Clara, they are clearing the people, the smallholders, the ones who refuse to sell. They burned them out. He looked toward the town, invisible in the darkness, and Dawes knows, he said, that is why he threatened you. That is why he wants you gone. You are a witness. Clara stood up, her legs shaking. Eli, what are you going to do? Eli's face was a mask of war. I am going to find out the truth, he said. And if Rourke and Dawes burned this valley to line their pockets, I am going to bring the whole mountain down on their heads. He looked at her, and the tenderness was gone, replaced by a terrifying resolve. Pack your things. Clara, tomorrow I am moving you and the boy to the upper cabin. It is hidden, defensible. Why? Clara asked, panic rising. Because, Eli said, touching the gun at his hip, I am going to start a fire of my own, and I will not let the flames touch you again. Clara watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had told him the truth to free herself from the guilt, but now she realized she had just lit the fuse on a war. Fire and blood. She thought, it always comes back to fire and blood. She looked out at the lightning, and for the first time, she feared the man who had saved her almost as much as she loved him. The high country had turned into a graveyard of ash and silence. Eli Calder rode through it with his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the devastation for truths that had been buried under the soot. He traveled alone, leaving Sam to guard the ranch, because the questions he needed to ask were dangerous, and he would not risk another man's life on a hunch. He rode north, into the ragged breaks where the timber was thickest and the shadows longest. He stopped at the crumbling remains of the Miller homestead. It had been a sturdy cabin of squared logs, built by a man with calloused hands and a stubborn dream. Now, it was nothing but a black scar on the hillside, the chimney standing like a tombstone in a field of charcoal. Jeb Miller was there, sifting through the wreckage with a shovel, looking for anything the fire might have spared. A cast-iron skillet, a belt buckle, a wedding ring. He looked up as Eli approached, his face a mask of soot and grief. Mr. Calder, Jeb said, leaning on his shovel. Eli dismounted, keeping his hands visible. I am sorry for your loss. Jeb spat into the gray dust. Sorry does not build a roof. Eli, but I thank you. Eli walked closer, the smell of wet carbon filling his nose. How did it start? Jeb, the wind was blowing east that day. You should have had time. That is just it, Jeb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It came from nowhere. 1 minute the air was clear. The next the whole ridge was a wall of flame. It did not travel along the ground like a grass fire. It started in the brush right behind the barn, like it was planted there. Eli nodded, his suspicion hardening into certainty. And the timbermen? They were here before the smoke cleared, Jeb said bitterly. Rourke's men. They came riding up with their maps and their pencils, marking the standing trees on the ridge. Said they were doing me a favor, assessing the salvage value. Offered me 10 cents on the dollar for the land. Said I might as well sell since I was burned out anyway. Did you sell? I've got 3 little ones and a wife sleeping in a wagon down by the river, Jeb said. What choice do I have? Eli reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it to Jeb. $50, Eli said. Do not sell to Rourke. Rebuild. Jeb stared at the pouch, then at Eli. Why? Because that fire was not an act of God, Eli said, his voice cold. And I intend to prove it. He rode on, visiting 3 other camps. The story was the same. The fire started suddenly, in places that defied the wind. The timber surveyors appeared like vultures before the embers were cold. And always, the whisper of Sheriff Dawes, telling the farmers that the law could do nothing, that it was best to take what money they could get and move on. It was a land grab, simple and bloody. Rourke was burning the valley to clear the board, and Dawes was holding the door open for him. Back at the ranch, the autumn winds had begun to scour the plateau. They came down from the peaks with a howl that rattled the window panes and sent dust devils spinning across the yard. The sky turned a hard, relentless blue, stripped of clouds. Clara Hayes felt the isolation in her bones. With Eli gone, the big stone house felt cavernous. She kept herself busy, fighting a war against the dust that seeped through every crack. She managed the kitchen, directed Mrs. Gable, and in the evenings, she sat at the heavy oak desk in the study, tallying the accounts, but she could not tally the loneliness. She felt the eyes of the ranch hands on her when she crossed the yard to fetch water or hang laundry. They were not unkind men, mostly, but they were superstitious and wary of change. To them, she was an anomaly, a woman living under the boss's roof without a ring, a widow with a dark past. One afternoon, she went to the bunkhouse to deliver a basket of mended shirts. 2 women were there, wives of the senior hands who lived in the small cabins near the creek. They stopped talking abruptly when Clara entered. "Good afternoon," Clara said, setting the basket down. "Mrs. Pike." A sharp-faced woman with hands red from lye gave a tight, thin smile. "We were just wondering when Mr. Calder is due back. Mrs. Hayes, it must be difficult for you, managing his affairs all alone." "He will be back when his business is done," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "I am sure." "Mrs." Pike said, "though it is strange, is it not? A man like him leaving a woman like you in charge of the books. Usually, that is a wife's work, or a partner's." "I am an employee," Clara said, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "I have a contract. Mrs." Pike exchanged a glance with the other woman. "Of course. A contract. Is that what they are calling it now? In town, they have a different word for it." Clara stiffened. "And what word is that?" "Mrs." Pike stepped closer, her voice dropping to a faux whisper. "They say you are using that baby to burrow your way into his money. They say you trapped him with a sob story, and now you are warming his bed to keep your place. It is not decent. Clara, a woman with your history, you should know your place." Clara turned on her heel and walked out, her head high, but inside she was crumbling. Her history, it always came back to Thomas, to the bruises, the debts, the shame. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how clean she kept the ledger, she was still just the drunkard's widow who had found a richer protector. 2 days later, the sheriff rode up the lane. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. Dawes sat on a dappled gray mare, his star gleaming in the sunlight. He did not come with deputies this time. He came alone, which somehow made it worse. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and went out to the porch. She would not let him see her hide. "Sheriff," she said, standing at the top of the steps, "Mr. Calder is not here." "I know," Dawes said, swinging down from the saddle. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps, removing his hat. He smiled, and it was a smile that did not reach his flat, pale eyes. "I am not here for Eli. I am here to check on you. Mrs. Hayes, part of my official duties, fire recovery and welfare of the displaced." "We are fine," Clara said. "We have food and shelter." "So I see," Dawes said. looking around the expansive porch. "Quite a step up from that shack on the edge of town. You have landed on your feet. Clara, most women in your situation, well, they struggle. What do you want?" "Sheriff?" Dawes leaned against the porch post, picking a piece of lint off his sleeve. "There is concern in the county. Clara, about the boy. Jamie, is it?" Clara's heart stopped. "What about him?" "Well, the court has to consider the environment a child is raised in," Dawes said smoothly. "His father was a violent man. A drunk, and now his mother is living unsupervised, in the home of a bachelor with a reputation for violence." "I work here," Clara said, her voice trembling with fury. "I am the housekeeper." Dawes tutted softly. "So you say. But appearances matter. Clara, and right now, it appears that you are living in sin. The preacher is concerned. The judge is concerned. They are wondering if a woman with your judgment is fit to raise a son." Clara gripped the railing, her knuckles white. "You are threatening to take my baby." "I'm just saying that the county has orphanages," Dawes said, his voice hard as iron now. "Places where children are raised with morals, unless what?" "Unless you cooperate," Dawes said. "We know you were in the woods the day of the fire. We know you think you heard things. But the memory is a tricky thing. Clara, smoke plays tricks on the mind. If you were to testify, if you were to spread lies about good businessmen like Mr. Rourke, well, that would prove you are unstable. That would prove you are unfit." He stepped closer, invading her space. "Keep your mouth shut. Clara, forget what you think you heard, and maybe the county will overlook your current arrangement." He put his hat back on. "Tell Eli I stopped by." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with a fluid grace. Clara watched him ride away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She sank down onto the porch steps, wrapping her arms around her knees. They would take Jamie. The fear was a cold hand squeezing her heart. She remembered the nights Thomas had threatened to give the boy away if she didn't stop crying. She remembered the helplessness. And now, because she was here, because she was near Eli, she was in danger again. She was the weak link. Rourke and Dawes knew they couldn't break Eli, so they were going to break her to get to him. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she thought about running. Not to save herself, but to remove the target from Eli's back and to hide Jamie where Dawes couldn't find him. Eli returned 3 nights later. The wind was howling around the eaves, a banshee scream that drowned out the sound of his horse's hooves. Clara was in the parlor, mending a tear in one of Jamie's blankets, when the front door opened. A gust of cold air and grit blew into the room. Eli stumbled in, leaning heavily against the doorframe before kicking it shut. "Eli!" Clara dropped the sewing and ran to him. He was covered in gray dust, his clothes torn. His hat was gone, but it was the way he held his left arm that stopped her. It was pressed tight against his ribs, and the sleeve of his coat was dark and wet. "I'm all right," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. "You are bleeding," Clara cried. She moved to his side, slipping her arm around his waist to support him. He was heavy, smelling of sweat and iron and horsehair. He flinched when she touched him but didn't pull away. "Just a graze," he grunted. "Ambush? Near the canyon pass? 2 of them. Did you—" Clara couldn't finish the question. "They will not be coming back," Eli said grimly. She helped him into the study, guiding him to the leather sofa. He sank down with a groan, his head falling back. "I need warm water," Clara said, her housekeeper instincts overriding her panic. "And whiskey, and the sewing kit. I can do it," Eli muttered, trying to unbutton his coat with one hand. "Hush," Clara ordered. "You will do no such thing." She ran to the kitchen, fetching a basin of hot water and clean rags. When she returned, she poured a glass of whiskey and pressed it into his good hand. "Drink." Eli obeyed, the amber liquid vanishing in one swallow. Clara set to work. She peeled the heavy coat off him, hissing when she saw the shirt soaked in blood. She cut the fabric away with her shears. The bullet had plowed a furrow across the top of his shoulder. It was deep and angry, but it had missed the bone and the artery. Still, it was ugly, and it needed stitching. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. "Do it," Eli said through gritted teeth. Clara dipped the rag in the water and began to clean the wound. Eli's muscles bunched under her fingers, hard as rock. He did not make a sound, but his breath hissed in through his nose. She worked with steady hands, though her heart was hammering. She was painfully aware of him, the heat of his skin, the breadth of his chest, the scars that crisscrossed his torso from other fights, other fires. He was a map of violence, yet he sat there trusting her with his pain. She threaded the needle. She stitched the wound closed, her fingers brushing against his neck, his collarbone. Every touch sent a jolt through her. When she tied the final knot and snipped the thread, Eli let out a long, shuddering breath. "It is done," she whispered. She began to bandage the shoulder. Eli turned his head to watch her. His face was inches from hers. The pain had stripped away his defenses, leaving his eyes raw and open. "You have steady hands." "Clara," he murmured. "I had to learn," she said, not looking at him. "Thomas. He got into fights. I had to patch him up so he could go to work." Eli reached out with his good hand and caught her wrist. "I am not Thomas," he said fiercely. Clara went still. She looked up at him. "No, you are not." The air in the room changed. The smell of blood and antiseptic faded, replaced by the scent of him and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The wind outside seemed to fade away. Eli's thumb stroked the inside of her wrist, right over her pulse. "I thought about you," he said, his voice low. "When the bullets started flying, I thought, I cannot die. I have to get back. I have to make sure she is safe. Eli." He leaned forward. The movement was slow, a question rather than a demand. Clara could have pulled away. She could have stood up and retreated to her contract and her propriety. But she didn't. She leaned in. Their lips met. It was tentative at first, a brush of skin, a testing of the waters. Clara's hands were still resting on his chest, near the bandages. Eli's hand moved from her wrist to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Then something broke. The fear of the last few weeks, the loneliness, the terror of Dawes's threats, the relief of seeing him alive. It all surged up. Clara made a small sound in her throat and pressed closer. Eli groaned, a low vibration against her lips. He deepened the kiss, his mouth hungry and desperate. It wasn't the rough, taking kisses of her husband. It was a giving. It was a plea. It was a man drowning and finding air. Clara's fingers curled into the hair at the nape of his neck. For a moment, she forgot the town, the sheriff, the baby sleeping upstairs. She was just a woman, and he was just a man, and they were alive in a hard world. They pulled apart slowly, breathless. Eli rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. "Clara," he breathed. Clara pulled back, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. Reality crashed back in. She was the housekeeper. He was the owner. She was the target. He was the protector. I should check on Jamie," she stammered, pulling away from his touch. Eli opened his eyes. There was confusion there, and a flicker of hurt, but he nodded. Clara gathered the bloody rags in the basin, her hands shaking so badly the water sloshed over the rim. She fled the room, leaving him sitting in the firelight, touching his lips. The next morning the house was tense. Clara avoided the study, focusing on baking bread in the kitchen. She felt raw, exposed. The kiss had changed everything. It had proven that the contract was a lie. It wasn't just a job. Around noon, Sam rode in. He went straight to the study where Eli was resting. The door was ajar. Clara walked past, carrying a stack of linens, and she heard her name. She stopped, pressing herself against the wall. She knew she shouldn't listen. She knew eavesdroppers never heard good of themselves, but fear pinned her there. "Dawes was here while you were gone. Sam was saying—" "I know," Eli's voice answered. heavy with fatigue. Clara told me, "He is squeezing her." "Eli," Sam said, "he is using the boy. He knows that is the way to get to you. As long as she is here. She is a leverage point. Rourke will not hesitate to use them to break you." "I know," Eli snapped. The frustration in his voice was explosive. "I never meant to drag them into this mess. Sam, I wanted to keep them safe, but now, having them here, it is like walking around with my heart on the outside of my chest. It is dangerous. For me, for the ranch." Clara put a hand over her mouth. She didn't hear the rest. She didn't hear Eli say, "But I will burn the whole world before I let them take her." She only heard, "It is dangerous. For me, for the ranch." She backed away silently, her face burning. She was a burden. She was a weakness. She was the crack in his armor that Rourke and Dawes were prying open. By staying here, she wasn't just risking Jamie, she was destroying Eli. She was the leverage. If she left, if she disappeared, Dawes would have no hold over Eli. Rourke couldn't use her to threaten him. And Eli? Eli would be free to fight the war he needed to fight without worrying about a washerwoman and her bastard child. She had to go. The windstorm returned that night with a vengeance. It battered the house, screaming like a wounded animal. Clara waited until the house was dark. She packed a single saddlebag with Jamie's clothes, a loaf of bread, and the few dollars she had saved from her wages. She dressed in her warmest woolen dress and wrapped Jamie in 2 blankets. She crept down the stairs, every creak sounding like a gunshot. The study door was closed. She paused there for a second, her hand hovering over the wood. She wanted to say goodbye. She wanted to explain, but if she saw him, she wouldn't be able to leave. She slipped out the back door into the howling night. The wind almost knocked her over. She fought her way to the barn, the lantern in her hand swinging wildly. Inside, the air was still and smelled of hay and horses. She went to the stall of the gentle gray mare Eli had taught her to ride. "I am borrowing her," she whispered to the darkness. "I will send her back when I can." She saddled the horse with trembling hands, struggling with the cinch. Jamie was awake now, fussing quietly, but the wind masked the sound. "Going somewhere?" Clara spun around. Eli stood in the open doorway of the barn. He held a lantern in his good hand. He was wearing his coat over his bandaged shoulder, his face pale and drawn. "Eli." She gasped. He walked into the light, his eyes dark with betrayal. "In the middle of the night? Without a word? After last night, I have to go," Clara said, backing up against the horse. "Why?" Eli demanded. "Because of a kiss. Because you are afraid of what you feel. Because I am killing you," Clara shouted. The words hung in the barn. Eli stopped. "What? I heard you," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "I heard you talking to Sam. You said I was a leverage point. You said dragging us into this was a mistake. You said we were dangerous to the ranch." Eli stared at her. Then he let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You foolish woman." He said, "You listened to half a conversation and decided to run away?" "I am not foolish," Clara cried. "Dawes threatened to take Jamie. He said if I stay here, they will take him because I'm an unfit mother living in sin. And he is right. Eli, as long as I'm here, they can use me to hurt you. If I go, if I disappear, you can fight them. You can win." She tried to mount the horse. Eli moved fast. He grabbed the reins, pulling the horse's head down. "You are not going anywhere." "Let me go," Clara struggled, trying to push past him. "It is the only way." "It is not the way," Eli roared, his voice cracking. He dropped the reins and grabbed her by the shoulders, her upper arms, gentle but firm. "Do you think I care about the leverage? Do you think I care about the ranch?" "You should," Clara sobbed. "It is your life. You are my life." The confession tore out of him, raw and bleeding. Clara froze. Eli breathed hard, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. "I did not say you were dangerous because you are a burden. Clara, I said it is dangerous because I cannot think straight when you are near. I said I never meant to drag you into this because I cannot bear the thought of you being hurt." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "For 10 years, I have been dead. I have been a ghost walking around this house. Then you came out of the smoke, you and that boy, and for the first time since the fire, I want to live. You are the first thing I have wanted that I did not buy, the first thing that is real." Clara stared at him, her heart breaking open. "Eli, if you leave," he said, his voice trembling, "you take the light with you, and I will burn down the rest of the world in the dark." He let go of her arms. He stepped back, leaving the path to the door open. "But I will not keep you," he said quietly. "I will not be Thomas. I will not be a jailer. If you want to go, if you truly believe you are safer out there in the cold than here with me, then go." Clara looked at the open barn door. The wind was shrieking outside, carrying the scent of snow and ash. She looked at the mare, saddled and ready. She looked at Jamie, warm in her arms. Then she looked at Eli. He stood with his shoulders slumped, defeated not by Rourke or Dawes, but by her. She loved him. She knew it then, with a certainty that terrified her. But she also knew Dawes. She knew the law. She knew that as long as she was Clara Hayes, the widow, the washerwoman, living in Eli Calder's house, she was a weapon that would be used to destroy him. She had to save him, even if it broke them both. "I cannot let them take Jamie," she whispered, "and I cannot let them destroy you to get to me." She turned and swung up into the saddle. "Clara," Eli said, "the word a plea. I am sorry." She said. She kicked the mare's flanks. The horse bolted forward, out of the barn, into the teeth of the wind. Eli did not run after her. He stood in the doorway, the lantern swinging in his hand, watching the darkness swallow the only woman who had ever made him feel worthy of forgiveness. He watched until the hoofbeats were lost in the roar of the gale. Then he turned and threw the lantern against the stone wall. It shattered, the oil igniting in a burst of flame. But Eli didn't even flinch. He just watched it burn, feeling the cold settle deep into his soul. Iron Ridge was a scar on the face of the mountains, a place where the earth had been turned inside out in the search for silver and lead. It sat perched on a precarious slope 20 miles north of Ash Creek, a collection of hasty shacks and canvas tents clinging to the rock like barnacles. The air here did not smell of pine or sage. It smelled of sulfur, wet ash, and unwashed bodies. Clara Hayes scrubbed the floor of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the rough bristles of the brush tearing at her raw hands. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the sky outside was already darkening, heavy with the threat of winter. The windows of the saloon were coated in a layer of grime that turned the daylight into a bruised purple haze. She had been here for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hell. She dipped the brush into the bucket of gray water, wincing as the lye soap stung a fresh cut on her thumb. She was living in a room above the saloon, a space barely large enough for a cot and Jamie's crate. The walls were thin as paper. Every night, she lay awake clutching her son, listening to the miners fighting, gambling, and shouting in the street below. Drunken fists often banged on her door, followed by slurred demands that she ignored, her heart hammering against her ribs until the heavy boots moved on. Mr. Kincaid, the owner of the Silver Dollar, walked past her, his polished boots stopping inches from her face. He was a thick man with a face like a slab of beef and eyes that weighed everything in ounces of silver. "You missed a spot. Mrs. Hayes," he said, nudging her shoulder with his toe. "I will get it." "Mr. Kincaid," Clara said, keeping her head down. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a greasy purr, "I have told you before. You do not have to ruin those pretty hands scrubbing floors. There is easier work upstairs. The boys are lonely. They would pay good coin for a woman with your softness." Clara sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with her forearm. She looked Kincaid in the eye, her expression hard. "I scrub floors. Mr. Kincaid, that is what you pay me for. If you want someone for the upstairs rooms, you look elsewhere." Kincaid chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "You have spirit. I like that. But winter is coming. Clara, those drafty walls upstairs get mighty cold. A woman has to think about her baby. I am thinking about him, Clara said, dipping the brush back into the water with a splash. That is why I'm scrubbing your floor. She watched him walk away, rage and fear warring in her gut. She had fled the ranch to save Eli, to remove the target from his back. But she had traded a cage of gold for a cage of mud. Every day was a battle to keep Jamie fed and warm. Every night was a battle to keep her hope from guttering out like a candle in a draft. Outside, the landscape was a testament to greed. The forests that had once covered these slopes were gone, reduced to fields of jagged stumps that looked like broken teeth. Huge slag heaps of waste rock loomed over the town, unstable and gray. The streams ran thick with the runoff from the stamp mills, poisoning the water until it killed anything that drank it. It was a hateful place. But it was anonymous. No one here knew Eli Calder. No one here cared about a washerwoman's reputation. Or so she hoped. At the ranch, the silence was louder than the wind. Eli Calder stood in his study, staring at the map on the wall. He looked thinner. The lines around his mouth were etched deeper, and his gray eyes burned with a feverish intensity. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, constant ache, but he ignored it. Sam stood by the desk, holding a sheaf of papers. They are moving fast. Boss, Sam said, Rourke has filed claims on the Miller place in the Henderson section. He is claiming the land was abandoned. The county clerk is rubber stamping everything Dawes puts in front of him. And the cattle? Eli asked. Not turning around. Sam hesitated. We got a notice yesterday, a summons. They say our herd drifted onto the northern section, land you have owned for 20 years. They are claiming trespass. They say the title is unclear because the records were damaged in the fire. Eli turned then, his face like a thunderhead. Damaged. How convenient. It is a squeeze play. Eli, Sam said, they want to tie you up in court while they strip the valley bare. And with you focused on the legal fight, they think I will forget about the fire. Eli finished. They think I will forget about justice. He walked to the desk and poured a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a rage he was barely containing. Any word on Clara? He asked, his voice changing, dropping an octave. Sam sighed. I sent Shorty up to the high camps. He spoke to a mule skinner coming down from Iron Ridge. Eli went still. And? The man said he saw a woman matching her description, scrubbing floors at the Silver Dollar. Said she has a baby with her. Iron Ridge. Eli whispered. That cesspool? There is more, Sam said quietly. The Skinner said he saw Sheriff Dawes up there 2 days ago, asking questions, showing a picture. Eli's glass shattered. He had squeezed it until it broke, water and shards of glass falling to the rug. He didn't even look at his hand, which was dripping blood. Dawes is hunting her, Eli said. He is, Sam agreed. And if he finds her up there, there is no law in Iron Ridge. Eli, only what men make with their fists and their guns. Eli strode out of the room, ignoring the blood on his hand. Saddle the black, he ordered. Boss, look at the window, Sam called after him. The snow is starting. The pass will be treacherous. I do not care if the pass is a wall of ice. Eli roared, grabbing his coat from the rack. I am going to get her. The snow began as large, lazy flakes that melted when they hit the mud of Iron Ridge. But by noon the next day, it was driving hard, stinging like sand. The town was huddled in on itself, the miners retreating to the warmth of the saloons and the gambling halls. Clara was in the alley behind the Silver Dollar, emptying the slop bucket. The cold bit through her thin shawl, making her shiver violently. She hurried to finish, eager to get back to Jamie, whom she had left sleeping in the corner of the kitchen near the stove. Mrs. Hayes. The voice stopped her heart. She turned slowly, the empty bucket hanging from her hand. Sheriff Dawes stood at the mouth of the alley. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, flecked with snow. His star was pinned to the outside, dull in the gray light. Behind him stood 2 men, not deputies in uniform, but hard-eyed men with shotguns in the crooks of their arms. Sheriff, Clara whispered. Dawes smiled, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock friendliness. Found you. You are a hard woman to track. Clara, we have been worried sick. I am fine, Clara said, backing up until her heels hit the mud-slicked wooden wall of the saloon. Are you? Dawes asked, stepping into the alley. His boots squelched in the muck. You look tired. Clara, you look like a woman at the end of her rope. Scrubbing floors in a place like this? It is no place for a lady, and certainly no place for a child. Leave us alone, Clara said, gripping the handle of the bucket as if it were a weapon. We are not breaking any laws. Ah, but you are, Dawes said, his voice hardening. You are a person of interest in a county investigation. You fled the jurisdiction. That looks like guilt to me. Guilt of what? Of negligence, Dawes said, and perhaps conspiracy. You see, Eli Calder seems to be losing his mind. He is making wild accusations. He is threatening upstanding businessmen, and we hear he has moved on. Clara felt a cold knot in her stomach. Moved on? Oh yes. Dawes lied smoothly. He is cutting a deal with Rourke, selling off the northern parcels. He realized that fighting was costing him too much money. He has forgotten all about his little housekeeper. Clara stared at him. For a second, the doubt flared. Eli was a businessman. He had said himself that she was a burden. Maybe he had decided to cut his losses, but then she remembered his face in the barn. She remembered the way he had said, "You are the first thing I have wanted that I did not buy." You are a liar, Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Eli would never sell out, and he would never forget us. Dawes' smile vanished. It was replaced by a look of cold, reptile boredom. Have it your way. I tried to be nice. Clara, I tried to do this the easy way. He signaled to the men behind him. Grab the boy. Clara screamed. No! She threw the bucket at Dawes. It struck him in the shin, splashing slop onto his trousers. He cursed and lunged forward. Clara turned and scrambled toward the back door of the kitchen. She burst inside, startling Mrs. O'Leary, the cook. Jamie! Clara gasped, scooping her son from his basket near the stove. She didn't stop. She ran through the kitchen, bursting into the main room of the saloon. It was crowded with miners seeking shelter from the snow. The piano player stopped mid-tune as Clara ran in, clutching her baby, her eyes wild. Help me, she cried. Please, they are trying to take my son. The miners looked up, confused, their faces slack with drink and fatigue. Dawes kicked the kitchen door open. He strode into the saloon, his hand on the butt of his revolver. Stay out of this, Dawes shouted to the room. This is official county business. That woman is a fugitive. He is lying. Clara backed away, knocking over a chair. He wants to hurt us to get to Eli Calder. Dawes advanced on her, circling the tables. Give me the child. Clara. We are taking him to the orphanage. He will be safe there. Safer than with a whore in a mining camp. I am not a whore, Clara shrieked. She backed toward the swinging doors at the front of the saloon. She pushed through them, stumbling out into the muddy street. The snow was swirling thick and white now. A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the shouting. Men stood in the doorways of the Mercantile and the essay office, watching with the passive curiosity of people who had seen too much violence to interfere. Dawes followed her out, his 2 hired guns flanking him. Nowhere to run. Clara, Dawes said, the pass is snowed in. You are trapped. He reached out a hand. Hand him over. Clara clutched Jamie so tight the baby began to wail. She stepped back, her boots slipping in the freezing mud. She looked at the faces in the crowd, rough men, tired men. No one stepped forward. In Iron Ridge, you minded your own business if you wanted to live. I will die first, Clara hissed. Dawes drew his revolver. He didn't aim it at her, but the threat was clear. Do not be stupid, he said. Then, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind. It wasn't the rhythmic trot of a traveler. It was the thunder of a gallop, reckless and desperate on the slick street. Dawes turned. A horse erupted from the curtain of snow. It was a massive black beast, its chest heaving, steam blowing from its nostrils like smoke from a dragon. Eli Calder pulled the reins hard, sliding the horse to a halt in a spray of mud, right between Clara and the sheriff. He was off the saddle before the horse had even stopped moving. He hit the ground and placed himself instantly in front of Clara. His coat swept back to reveal the gun at his hip. He looked like a demon rising from the earth. His face was wind-burned, his eyes burning with a mixture of terrified relief and murderous rage. "Touch her," Eli snarled, his voice low and vibrating with menace. "And I will leave you in the mud for the pigs." Dawes took a step back, startled by the sudden appearance. "You get behind me, Clara!" Eli ordered without looking back. Clara pressed her face into his back, sobbing with relief. He was solid. He was warm. He was here. "You are out of your jurisdiction." "Dawes," Eli said, "and you are harassing my people." "Your people?" Dawes laughed, recovering his composure. "She is a runaway. Calder. And you are trespassing. This is a lawful welfare check. It is a kidnapping," Eli shot back. "You are doing Rourke's dirty work. You think if you squeeze her, I will drop the lawsuit? You think if you take the boy, I will sign over the land? I think you are confused," Dawes said. "Boys, show Mr. Calder the law." The two men with shotguns stepped forward, leveling their weapons at Eli. The street went silent. The wind howled through the gaps between the buildings. Eli's hand hovered over his Colt. He was fast, but he wasn't faster than two shotguns. "Walk away." "Eli," Dawes said, "leave the girl. Ride back to your cows." Eli did not move. He spread his feet, planting himself in the mud. "No." Clara looked at the shotguns. She looked at Eli's broad back. He was going to die. He was going to die for her, right here in the mud. She couldn't let him do it alone. She stepped out from behind him. She moved to his side, clutching Jamie, her head high. "If you shoot him," she said, her voice ringing out in the cold air. "You have to shoot me too." Eli glanced at her, panic flaring in his eyes. "Clara, get back." "No," she said, looking him in the eye. "We do this together, or not at all." Her courage sent a ripple through the watching crowd. These were men who worked hard and died young. They knew fear, but they also knew grit when they saw it. One of the men on the boardwalk, a miner with a gray beard and a jacket patched with different colors of wool, stepped down into the mud. "Hey!" the miner shouted. Dawes glanced over. "Get back inside." "Old man!" The miner ignored him. He pointed a gnarled finger at Clara. "That woman fixed my coat last week. Did not charge me a dime when I told her I was broke." He looked at Dawes. "And I know you. You were asking around about Rourke." "Shut up!" Dawes snapped. "I will not shut up!" the miner yelled. "I was there. Sheriff, I was on the ridge above the Miller place the day of the fire. I saw Rourke's foreman. I saw them carrying cans of kerosene into the brush." A murmur went through the crowd. "Liar!" Dawes shouted, turning his gun toward the old man. "I saw it too," another voice called out. A younger miner stepped forward. "I saw the tracks. They rode straight back to the timber camp." The mood in the street shifted instantly. The apathy was gone, replaced by the righteous anger of men who had been pushed too far by company bosses and corrupt lawmen. They began to step off the boardwalks, hands going to their belts, picking up shovels and pickaxes. Dawes saw the tide turning. Panic flickered in his eyes. "Kill them!" Dawes screamed to his hired guns. "Kill them all!" He raised his gun to shoot the old miner. Eli moved. He drew his Colt with a speed that blurred in the snowy air. He didn't fire at the men with shotguns. He fired at Dawes. Crack! The shot echoed between the buildings. Dawes's gun flew from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. He screamed, clutching his arm. Chaos erupted. The two hired men opened fire. The boom of the shotguns was deafening. Clara saw the flash. She didn't think. She threw herself to the ground, curling her body over Jamie to shield him. Eli grunted as if he had been punched. A spray of buckshot caught him in the thigh, knocking his leg out from under him. He went down to one knee. "Eli!" Clara screamed. She scrambled toward him in the mud. He was trying to rise, firing back. One of the shotgun men spun around, clutching his chest. The other man pumped his slide, aiming at Eli's head. Clara grabbed Eli's coat and dragged him with all her strength. "Move!" she screamed. She hauled him behind the heavy wheel of a freight wagon just as the second blast shredded the wood where Eli's head had been a second before. The townsfolk roared. A dozen guns opened up from the doorways. The remaining hired man threw down his shotgun and ran, vanishing into the alley. Dawes was on his knees in the street, holding his shattered wrist, blood dripping into the snow. He looked around, wild-eyed, to find himself surrounded by 50 angry miners. Eli leaned against the wagon wheel, his face gray with pain. Blood was soaking his trousers leg. Clara was on him instantly, her hands pressing down on the wound. "I have got you," she sobbed. "I have got you." Eli looked at her. He reached up and touched her face, smearing a streak of mud and blood on her cheek. "You stayed," he whispered. "I told you," she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his leg. "Together." Dawes was dragged over by the old miner and thrown into the mud at Eli's feet. "The law is coming," Dawes spat, though he was shaking. "You cannot do this to a sheriff." "You are not a sheriff," Eli said, his voice raspy. "You are a criminal, and you are going to tell the federal marshal everything, every bribe, every fire, every name." "Or what?" Dawes sneered. "Or I will leave you with them," Eli said, nodding to the circle of miners who were gripping their pickaxes with white-knuckle rage. Dawes looked at the crowd. He saw no mercy there. He slumped, defeated. "I will talk," he whispered. "Get me a doctor. I will talk." They carried Eli into the doctor's office, a small room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and sawdust. The doctor, a man with whiskey on his breath but steady hands, cut away Eli's trouser leg. It went through the muscle, the doctor said, probing the wound, missed the bone and the artery. "He is lucky, but it needs cleaning and stitching." Clara stood by the head of the table. She was trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She was covered in mud, her hair wild, her dress torn, but she refused to leave. "Hold his hand," the doctor said. "This will sting." Clara took Eli's hand. It was cold. Eli looked up at her. His eyes were hazy with pain and shock. "Clara," he murmured. "I am here," she said. "Listen to me," he said, his grip tightening painfully. If I do not make it, you are going to be fine," Clara said fiercely. "No, listen," he insisted. "In my desk, the bottom drawer. There is a will. I wrote it the day you left." Clara froze. "Everything," Eli whispered. "The ranch, the land, the money. It is all yours, yours and the boys. I left it all to you." Clara stared at him, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Eli said, his eyes drifting shut as the doctor began to work. "Because it was never really mine until you came." The doctor poured iodine into the wound. Eli's back arched off the table, a groan tearing from his throat. Clara leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, holding him down, anchoring him to the world. "Stay with me," she commanded. "You do not get to leave me all those cows." Eli called her. "You stay and work them yourself." He didn't answer, breathing through the pain, but he didn't let go of her hand. News traveled fast, even in the snow. By the time the federal marshal arrived from Denver 3 days later, Dawes had sung like a bird. He gave up Rourke. He gave up the timber company executives back east. He gave up the locations of the hidden ledgers. Rourke tried to run. He heard about the arrest and saddled his fastest horse, heading for the Utah border. But Eli Calder was not a man who left things unfinished, despite his stitched leg, despite the cane he now had to use. Eli organized a posse. It wasn't a mob. It was a disciplined group of ranch hands and deputized miners. They caught Rourke in a box canyon 10 miles west. He tried to shoot his way out, but when he saw 50 rifles leveled at him from the rim, he threw down his gun. Eli rode down to him. He sat on his horse, his legs stiff, looking down at the man who had burned his valley. "Is this it?" Rourke sneered. "You going to hang me?" "Calder." "No," Eli said. "Hanging is too quick. You are going to prison. Rourke. And you are going to spend every day of the rest of your life knowing that a washerwoman and a cripple brought you down." They tied Rourke to his saddle and led him back to justice. That evening, in the small room above the clinic where they were waiting for the snow to clear so they could travel. Clara sat by the window. Jamie was asleep in a real crib the doctor had found. Eli was sitting on the edge of the bed, his leg propped up. He was watching her. "You wrote a will," Clara said softly, not turning around. "I did. You left us everything. I did." Clara turned to face him. She walked across the room and stood between his knees. She placed her hands on his shoulders. "You thought you were going to die," she said. "I thought I might," Eli admitted. "And you wanted to make sure we were safe. I wanted to make sure you were free," Eli corrected. "That you never had to scrub another floor or answer to another man." Clara looked down at him. Her heart was so full it felt like it was pressing against her ribs. "I do not want your money, Eli," she said. Eli's face fell slightly. "I know. You want your independence." "No," Clara said. She reached down and took his face in her hands. "I want you." She leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't the desperate, frightened kiss of the study. It was a promise. It was soft and slow and deep. Eli's arms came around her waist, pulling her closer. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in her scent. "I love you," he whispered against her skin. Clara pulled back to look at him, smiling through her tears. "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now, let us go home. The cows are waiting." Eli laughed, a true, light sound that banished the last of the shadows in the room. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Let us go home." Winter descended on the high country with a heavy, muffling silence. It came first as a biting wind that stripped the last gold leaves from the aspens, and then as a relentless white curtain that fell for 4 days and 4 nights. When the sky finally cleared, revealing a blue so pale it looked like frozen glass, the world had been remade. The snow was a mercy. It blanketed the burned hillsides, softening the jagged edges of the devastation. It filled the charred ravines and capped the black stumps of the pines with pristine white crowns. From a distance, the valley looked peaceful, almost healed. But up close, the scars were still there. The pines that had survived stood black and skeletal against the sky, a somber regiment guarding the memory of the fire. Yet, on the southern slopes where the wind had turned, the timber remained thick and green, a stubborn reminder that not everything had been destroyed. Justice, much like the winter, moved slowly but with a crushing weight. The trial was not held in Ash Creek. The local courthouse was deemed too small, and the local prejudices too deep, to ensure a fair hearing. Instead, the proceedings were moved to Denver, to a brick courthouse with high windows and a gallery that smelled of varnish and damp wool. Eli Calder refused to hire a team of slick city lawyers to twist the law. He hired one man, a plain-spoken attorney who believed in facts, and the facts were damning. Sheriff Dawes, stripped of his badge and nursing a shattered wrist that would never hold a gun again, had turned on his masters. Facing federal charges for corruption and conspiracy, he had opened his safe and his mouth. He provided ledgers that detailed payments from the timber company. He provided letters from Rourke instructing him to ignore the complaints of the smallholders. He provided the dates and locations of the planned burns. Rourke sat at the defendant's table, chains rattling whenever he shifted. He wore a fine suit, but it hung loosely on him now. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He had expected his money to buy him a way out, but Eli Calder's influence had countered every bribe. Eli had made it known that any man caught taking Rourke's coin would answer to him personally. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from as far away as Chicago scratched furiously in their notebooks. But the silence was absolute when Clara Hayes took the stand. She wore a simple gray dress, the collar high and stiff. Her hands, resting on the rail of the witness box, still showed the faint pink marks of the burns she had suffered months ago. She looked out at the sea of faces, the judge in his black robes, the jury of 12 stone-faced men, and the crowd that had come to see the washerwoman who had defied a tycoon. "Mrs. Hayes," the prosecutor asked gently, "tell us what you heard in the forest on the 24th of August." Clara took a breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to choke her. She saw Rourke glaring at her. She saw the ghost of her old shame, the voice of the town telling her she was nothing. But then she looked at the front row of the gallery. Eli was there. He sat leaning forward, his hands clasped between his knees, his gray eyes locked on hers. He did not look worried. He looked proud. "I was gathering resin," Clara said, her voice trembling at first before finding its strength. "I was near the upper logging road. I saw 3 men. One of them was the foreman for the timber company." "And what did they say?" "They said the boss wanted the valley cleared by October," Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the hush. "They said a good fire might clear the hills faster than axes." A murmur went through the room. The judge banged his gavel. Clara continued, the memories flooding back, the smell of the smoke, the heat, the terror of holding Jamie while the world burned. She spoke of running through the flames. She spoke of the moment she thought she would die, and how she had prayed for forgiveness because she believed her life was worth less than the dust on the road. "I thought I was being punished," she said, tears standing in her eyes but not falling. "I thought because I was poor, because I was a widow, that I did not matter. But then Mr. Calder came. He rode into the fire when everyone else was running away." She looked directly at the jury. "They burned our homes to steal our land." She said, "They thought we were too small to fight back. They were wrong." When she stepped down, the room remained silent for a long beat. Some of the spectators, men who had likely judged her in the past, looked down at their boots. The women in the gallery dabbed at their eyes. Then it was Eli's turn. His testimony was not the defensive maneuvering the court expected from a wealthy landowner. It was a confession, under oath. Eli admitted to his role in the Range War of 1878. He spoke of the violence he had incited, the men he had hired, and the fire that had killed his fiancée. "I was no better than Rourke," Eli said, his voice rough as gravel. "I thought power gave me the right to shape the world to my liking. I thought the law was something I could buy." He gripped the rail of the stand, his knuckles white. "But I learned that you cannot buy back a life," he said. "And I learned that a man who builds his house on ash will eventually be buried in it. I am not here to claim I am a saint. I am here to say that men like Rourke and men like me must be held accountable. If we are not, then there is no law. There is only the strong eating the weak." It was a gamble. By admitting his past crimes, Eli risked his own reputation, but it stripped Rourke of his only defense. Rourke could not claim he was just doing business as usual, not when the biggest cattleman in the state was standing there calling it murder. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Rourke was found guilty on 12 counts of arson and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in the federal penitentiary. Dawes, for his cooperation, received 5 years, but he was stripped of his office and his pension, leaving the courtroom a broken, disgraced man. It was not perfect justice. The dead trees would not grow back in a day. The families who had lost everything could not buy back their memories. But as the gavel came down with a final, decisive crack, it felt like the breaking of a fever. The return to Ash Creek was quiet. The town had changed. The blackened hills were still there, looming over the streets. But the atmosphere of fear had lifted. With Rourke gone and Dawes in a cell, the invisible stranglehold on the valley was broken. When Eli and Clara rode down Main Street, people did not stare with open hostility. They tipped their hats. Mr. O'Malley, the storekeeper who had refused Clara credit, came out to the boardwalk as they passed. He looked at Clara, his face reddening, and gave a stiff, awkward nod. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. They stopped at the church to drop off a donation for the rebuilding fund. Mrs. Higgins was there, sorting through a box of winter coats. She stiffened when Clara walked in, but she did not turn her back. She walked over to Clara, holding a small, knitted cap made of soft blue wool. "For the boy." "Mrs. Higgins said, thrusting it into Clara's hands. "It is going to be a cold winter. Keep his ears covered." "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Clara said softly. The woman hesitated, then looked at Eli, who was waiting by the door. "He stood up for us, Mrs." Higgins muttered. "And you have grit. Clara Hayes, I will give you that." It was a small victory, but it was enough. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow fields in shades of lavender and rose. The cattle were huddled in the sheltered draws, dark shapes against the white. Smoke curled from the chimney of the big stone house, rising straight up into the calm, cold sky. For the first time, Clara did not feel like a guest. She felt like she was coming home. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the ranch shifted with the season. The work was less frantic now. It was a time of maintenance, of feeding stock, of repairing tack by the fire. One evening, after the day's work was done, Eli came into the kitchen. The room was warm and smelled of yeast. Clara was at the heavy wooden table, kneading dough for the morning's bread. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing her forearms. Her hair had escaped its pins, hanging loose around her face, and her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the oven. Jamie was in his high chair, banging a wooden spoon against a tin cup, babbling happily. Eli stopped in the doorway, watching them. He held a leather folio in his hand. Clara looked up, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "You are back early," she said, smiling. "Is the storm coming in?" "No," Eli said. "The sky is clear." He walked over to the table and placed the folio on the floured surface, careful not to let it touch the dough. "What is this?" Clara asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Eli took a breath. He looked nervous. This was a man who had faced down gunmen and testified before a federal judge. But here, in his own kitchen, he looked like a schoolboy. "I had Sam ride into Denver last week," Eli said, "to see the lawyer." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong? Is it Rourke?" "No," Eli said quickly. "It is not about the trial. It is about us." He opened the folio. Inside lay a stack of heavy, cream-colored paper covered in dense legal script. "You asked for a contract," Eli said. "When you agreed to come back, you wanted your duties listed. You wanted your wages guaranteed." Clara nodded slowly. "I remember. This is not that contract," Eli said. He tapped the paper. "This is a deed. Clara, it transfers 50% of the Calder Ranch, the land, the cattle, the timber rights, and the mining shares. To you." Clara stared at the paper. The numbers swam before her eyes. 50%. It was a fortune. It was more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. "Eli," she whispered, "I cannot take this." "Wait," Eli said. "There is more." He turned the page. "This is a petition for adoption. It names me as the legal father of James Hayes. It gives him my name. If you want it, it makes him my heir." Clara grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. The room seemed to tilt. She looked at Eli, searching for the catch, for the trap. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you give away half your empire?" "Because I do not want a housekeeper," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I do not want a mistress. And I do not want a charity case." He reached out and took her flowered hands in his. "I want a partner. Clara, I want an equal. I want to know that when I look across the table, I am looking at a woman who stays because she owns the roof over her head, not because she is afraid of the cold." He looked at Jamie, who had stopped banging his spoon and was watching them with wide eyes. "And I want a son," Eli said softly. "I want to teach him to ride. I want to show him the land. I want to leave something behind that is not just fences and money." Clara looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers small and covered in flour. The old voices rose up in her mind. "You are property," Thomas had said. "You are nothing without a man to keep you. You are ruined." She felt the weight of her own unworthiness. She was a washerwoman. She was damaged goods. How could she stand beside a man like Eli Calder and call herself his equal? But then she remembered the fire. She remembered the heat of the canyon and the way she had shielded Jamie with her own body. She remembered standing in the mud at Iron Ridge, stepping in front of a gun to save Eli. She was not weak. She was not nothing. She had walked through fire and come out the other side. Eli was not asking to own her. He was handing her the keys to her own freedom. He was asking her to share the burden and the glory of his life. She looked up at him. "You are sure?" she asked. "You are sure you want a washerwoman for a partner?" Eli smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I am sure I want the woman who saved my life," he said. "I am sure I want the woman who made me believe I had a soul left to save." Clara let out a sob that was half laugh. She pulled her hands free and threw her arms around his neck, heedless of the flower. "Yes," she whispered into his coat. "Yes." Eli wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet. He buried his face in her hair. "Thank God," he breathed. Later that night, the house was quiet. Jamie was asleep in his crib, a new woolen blanket tucked around him. Clara and Eli stood in the parlor. In front of the massive stone hearth, the fire was dying down to a bed of glowing coals, casting a warm, flickering light over the room. They had signed the papers. They lay on the desk in the study, ink drying, binding their lives together in the eyes of the law. But the law was cold paper. What was happening now was something older and deeper. Eli stood behind Clara, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. They were watching the embers. "Are you afraid?" Eli asked softly. "A little," Clara admitted. "It is a lot to hold." "We hold it together," Eli said. "That is the point." He turned her in his arms so she was facing him. The firelight danced in his eyes. He looked at her with a hunger that was no longer hidden, no longer tempered by guilt or hesitation. Clara looked back at him. She saw the scars on his neck, the gray in his hair, the strength in his shoulders. She saw the man who had ridden a terrified horse into a wall of flame for a stranger. She reached up and began to undo the buttons of his shirt. Her hands were steady. She was not trembling with fear, as she had with Thomas. She was trembling with anticipation. She was trembling with the terrifying vulnerability of being fully seen, fully known, and still chosen. Eli stood still, letting her undress him. When her fingers brushed the scar on his shoulder, he hissed in a breath, but he didn't pull away. He reached out and touched the ribbons of her bodice. "May I?" he asked. The question hung in the air. "May I?" "Not I will." "Yes," Clara said. He undressed her slowly, as if she were made of fine porcelain. When she stood before him, the firelight painting her skin in gold, he dropped to his knees. He pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her hips. "You are beautiful," he whispered. Clara ran her fingers through his hair. She felt a profound sense of safety wash over her, a warm tide that carried away the last of the shame. She was not used. She was cherished. She pulled him up. "Come to bed, Eli," she said. The night that followed was not like the storms that raged outside. It was a slow, deep burn. It was the discovery of warmth in the middle of winter. It was two broken people fitting their jagged edges together until they made something whole. Spring came to the high country not as a sudden event, but as a slow awakening. The snow retreated from the lower pastures, leaving behind earth that was dark and rich with moisture. The creeks, swollen with meltwater, ran clear and cold, singing over the stones. Clara rode the gray mare up the winding trail to the high ridge. She wore a split riding skirt now, and a hat with a wide brim to shield her eyes. She sat easily in the saddle, her body moving in rhythm with the horse. Beside her, Eli rode the big black gelding, and sitting in front of him, perched on the saddle horn and held secure by Eli's arm, was Jamie. The boy was a year old now. He wore a miniature coat and the blue hat Mrs. Higgins had knitted. He pointed a chubby finger at the hawk circling on the thermals. "Bird," Jamie shouted. "Pa, bird." Eli chuckled. "That is a red-tail. Sun, king of the sky." They reached the crest of the ridge and pulled the horses up. The valley lay spread out below them. It was still marked by the fire. The swaths of blackened stumps were visible, dark slashes across the landscape, but between the black, there was green. Millions of green shoots were pushing up through the ash, fireweed and aspen saplings, young pines and fresh grass. The land was healing. It was drinking the sun and turning the destruction into new life. Clara looked at the fire breaks Eli's men were digging in the distance, wide, clear lines that would protect the ranch in the future. She thought of the schoolhouse they were funding in town, and the new judge who had taken the bench in the county seat. They had built a life out of the ruin. The wind blew strong up here, tugging at Clara's hair and cooling her face. It was the same wind that had driven the fire, the same wind that had almost killed them. But it didn't feel like an enemy anymore. It was just the breath of the world, wild, unpredictable, and free. Clara looked at Eli. He was watching the boy, pointing out the distant herds. The sadness that had haunted his eyes for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. He felt her gaze and turned to her. He smiled and reached out his hand. Clara took it. She squeezed his fingers, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth. She thought of the day she had sat on the rock, surrounded by flames, praying for the end. She thought of the man who had burst through the smoke. They sat there for a long time, holding hands, their shadows stretching long across the recovering grass. They knew that there would be other fires. They knew that there would be droughts and storms and hard winters. The West was not a gentle place, but as they turned their horses back toward the ranch, toward the home they owned together, Clara knew that they would endure. Their love had been tempered in flame and forged in ash. It was the one steady, bright thing that would survive the storm. Thank you for journeying with me through the smoke and snow of the American West. It has been a privilege to share Clara and Eli's story of survival and redemption with you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Eli and Clara's journey resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where love is as wild and enduring as the land itself. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.